Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 35th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2024. Monica Lennon has joined us remotely this morning. There are maybe other MSPs joining, and if they do join, I will let people know. First item on the agenda is an item taking items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is consideration of the evidence that we will hear from Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow. Item 5 is consideration of the evidence heard on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. And item 6 is the consideration of correspondence from the Scottish Government regarding the reappointment of the Board of Environmental Standards Scotland. Are we all happy to take these items in private? We are. Our second item of business this morning is an evidence session with Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow, and I welcome to the meeting Andrew Miller, the Chairman, John Pettigrew, the Interim Chief Executive Officer, Simon Cunningham, a Board Member, and David Dishon, the Chief Financial Officer for Ferguson Marine. Now, we did try and ascertain whether you wanted an opening statement, but you didn't respond, so we're going to move straight into the questions this morning. And the first question is from me to you, Andrew, is at this vital time when Ferguson Marine are discussing their future and finishing off the vessels, we don't have a permanent CEO. So could you just tell us what's happening regarding the appointment of a permanent CEO?
We started looking for a permanent CEO some 12 months ago, and we've been unsuccessful in securing a candidate via the usual routes. We had one candidate who actually signed their contract but withdrew about 10 days ago, and we asked my learned fellow here to the left, John Pettigrew, to extend his interim contract under certain conditions, and he has agreed to do so.
So could you enlighten the committee to how long John's interim contract will remain interim?
He hasn't signed it yet. Things not quite on the paper, but it's to Easter next year, another 3.5 months. Okay.
And so will you be continuing to look for people during that period?
Yes, indeed. Okay. Somehow we don't seem to be the most attractive opportunity in the Scottish economy.
Okay. You can... Yes.
Why do you think that is, Mr Miller?
Because of the background, the history of the yard, 10 years' worth of, negative publicity surrounding the enterprise, the administrations, the delays to the ferries, etc., makes it less attractive than some other opportunities, especially given the financial package that is on offer.
How are you going to overcome that, Mr Miller, to get the right person?
Personality, drive, determination, every other way that we do.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just remind committee members, it's catch my eye, not jump in when I'm about to open my mouth, Mr Stewart. I'm not sure, Deputy Convener, did you want to come in at that stage as well?
If I could just ask Mr Miller, you mentioned the process that you'd used over the course of the last 12 months in order to try and secure a chief executive. What are you going to do differently this time in order to try and help to attract the right type of candidate?
It's a good question. There's been some opportunities in the market which have appeared in the short term, specifically in regards to a large commercial shipbuilder based in Belfast, who is in the process of going into administration or liquidation, looking for another opportunity, another partner as an owner, and that will release some people into the market who don't have future jobs.
So you're intending to target individuals that you think may be potentially suitable candidates?
The research organisation is doing that for us as we speak. Also, there's another company, I don't want to mention the company names, another company a bit closer to us who've let go about 50 senior managers and staff because of their financial outlook. They've decided to restructure a bit.
Okay, thanks.
Monica, if you had your hand up at that stage, I think you do, so I'll bring you in now.
Great, thank you, convener. Yeah, sorry to hear that you've been unable to appoint a new CEO. I just wondered if the way the previous official David Tideman had been sacked, if that has any bearing on the ability to recruit someone, and that's for Andrew Miller.
It doesn't help, but it's not the core of the issue. The core of the issue, as I previously mentioned, is the fact that we're looking for somebody who's exceptional, somebody who's got the background and experience that can add significant value to the enterprise and steer it in the correct and proper long-term direction, using, some state funds, but not in the longer term being subsidised or supported by the ministers who are currently the owners.
Okay, and are you able to explain what Project Domino is?
No.
You're not familiar with that? Okay, I may come back to it. Are any of your colleagues familiar with Project Domino? No.
Maybe you could develop that later.
Sorry, I can't hear the answer.
Sorry, there was there were blank faces across the all of the panellists. I think maybe if you'd like to, you could develop that slightly later in the committee meeting.
So just final question then for Andrew Miller. Is he able to explain for what reasons the board was unhappy with David Tideman's previous evidence to this committee? There's board papers that seem to suggest that the board was unhappy with unsubstantiated opinions he had given to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, this committee. So just interested to understand what is behind that.
Generally, Mr. Tideman had lost the confidence of the board in his ability to forecast both timetabling and financially. And at one of the evidence hearings, he made some statements which I believe the board believed weren't exactly accurate. Some of these statements overexcited some of our partners, and some letters of apology had to be written to these parties after the evidence was given, letters of apology.
Okay, well, I think it would be interesting to see those papers. So I'm just, again, I know you probably see a lot of paperwork. I'm just looking at the annex of information released under FOI, and sorry, I'm just scrolling down because on page 4 of that it talks about Project Domino and a submission to the Scottish Government, but you don't recall Project Domino.
I don't know what document you're referring to. If you can help trigger me by way of a date or when the FOI was requested, I might be able to help.
Okay, we're talking just earlier this year, March of this year. Well, I'll hand back to the convener, and I will just pull out the relevant dates if that helps to jog memories, and I can send a note to the convener. But back to you, convener.
Thank you. I've got some questions now for John. Sorry, we're talking about you when you were in the room. So now here's your chance to come back. I think when the committee visited the yard in February, I think that was myself and Jackie Dunbar went down and had a look around the yard, and we saw what was going on. We were then somewhat taken aback by the change and your moving in. And then you gave some dates. In fact, you gave 4 dates which for the delivery of the Glen Sannets, which were all missed. I'm trying to understand why they were missed, because that was the reason we were given as a Parliament for David Tideman's departure, that he was continually missing dates. You then went to miss 4. Could you enlighten us to why that happened, John?
Well, the complexity of the ship became more apparent as you went deeper into it, and I think we gave too much credence to the sea trials on the February date. The sea trials on the February date were actually just a way of demonstrating one fuel system operating. The other system hadn't even been installed yet, and as we know, we had complexities with that. I don't think anybody, including our partners, CMAL and CalMac, had the experience of LNG and the installation and the operation of it. The installation of it was far more complex than people thought, and even in the end, we had to hire private contractors to help us with watchkeeping. So there are people with experience in this area are very, very thin on the ground. They still are very, very thin on the ground. So when the ship operates, they're going to have to get more people trained in it, and we helped our partners get people trained such that they can take fuel on. The last delay was caused by the anchor not passing the relevant examination by MCA. It was noted that it had been done in the February trials, but it turned out it hadn't been done. The anchors had been lowered, but they hadn't been signed off. So this promulgated us having to get new parts and pieces to do it.
So I'm unclear what you mean by lowered but not signed off. Did they hit the bottom of the sea, and did they work? Or is it because somebody hadn't been in there to say that they'd seen it? I don't understand that. Could you just explain that?
Surely. I sometimes forget that not everybody's in shipbuilding.
Well, I've been doing the ferries for 8 years. I've got most of the ferry jargon, but not quite all of it.
So there's a thing called a gypsy, and basically it's a mechanism that connects to the anchor as it's lowering, so the anchor just doesn't free fall down. So just to explain to the committee, the anchors here are slightly different from what we recognise as anchors. They're actually a safety mechanism. They're not put down to harbour the boat in the far end of the Clyde. So they're a safety mechanism. So if you don't have that safety mechanism, the ship can't sail. So one of the anchors was slipping, and it was going down. So we could get it down, but we weren't sure we could get it back up again a second time. And the CMAL were concerned, the governing body was concerned, so we did modifications to that apparatus to make it work. And a permanent solution is on its way with, I call it Gypsy, the new Gypsies. So a permanent solution will be in there in the coming weeks.
So the ferry's been handed over without a permanent solution?
Without a permanent solution, yes, but a safe solution. It's signed off by MCA and it's signed off by Lloyds and it's agreed by CMAL.
Okay, so I've got two reasons, LNG and the anchor. There were 4 delays. Yeah.
Well, the LNG goes through all of them, to be frank with you. The LNG goes through all of them. It took us a considerable amount of time to get the LNG finally passed, and the last piece took about 3, maybe 4 weeks, and what it was a minute little bubble in one of the welds from the previous subcontractor that hadn't been looked at. We thought it had, but it hadn't. And this piping, and I'm using my hands, but this piping is a double-walled piping, so that the actual liquid goes through the inside wall. Then it's got a vapour that goes around it that keeps it cold. So if you have a fault there, you have to take this back off again and start again. So that's what promulgated. So the LNG was a string through three of the delays.
So your life would have been made easier if your predecessor's offer of making the vessels available without LNG had been accepted. Is that right?
Or if we'd have installed the LNG in the proper timing.
Okay. Kevin, I think you wanted, and I'd like to ask some further questions afterwards. Kevin.
I think there's an understanding about LNG being a new technology, and I've just heard what you've said about getting it right to begin with. But anchors are not new technology, so why is it the case that the anchor mechanisms have to be looked at once again?
Well, they were bought 7 years ago, so I wasn't here 7 years ago. So 7 years ago, obviously, the proper QC, QA procedures weren't put in place.
So when did you become aware that this wasn't the right kit?
When it was sitting across my Esplanade in Greenock and they lowered it, and I got a report back that it hadn't passed.
Why did none of your predecessors recognise that this wasn't the right kit? Maybe Mr. Miller can answer that as a chair.
I can't speak for my predecessors. I can only speak for the items that happened in my watch.
Maybe Mr. Miller can talk about some of the predecessors.
The process of clearing something, you know, we are the shipbuilder, but there's a regulator, the MCA, who has oversight, and also Lloyd's List have oversight as well. You know, clearly some things are tried and tested, some things are tried and tested in front of the regulator, and they don't work, and therefore we've got to go back a little bit and correct. But most of the issues were, as John said, surrounded LNG, which...
So we've dealt with LNG. I'm asking about a very simple and basic thing, which is an anchor system, which is not a new technology. And for what I'm trying to get
it's not. The point I'm making
why is it that that was wrong?
The point I'm making is the anchor was used and there was no issues, and then with oversight of the MCA, when the anchor was used, when it was out in sea trials, there was a problem with that piece of kit.
So you're saying the item was used and there were no issues, and yet it wasn't signed off at that particular point in time for whatever reason, as Mr. Pettigrew has just said. Why is it that it took to another point to recognise that this anchor equipment wasn't the right stuff? I mean, I'm the grandson of a shipbuilder, but I wouldn't proclaim to know a huge amount about shipbuilding. But what I would say is that anchoring is a pretty old technology. How can you get that wrong?
Do you want me to answer?
When you go.
So, to go back to my answer, it was shown to have been signed off in February in the February sea trials. When I went to my counterpart in CMAL, he said yes, it had been dropped, but it hadn't been signed off, so he would like to see it dropped again. And when it was dropped again, the coupling didn't function the way it was supposed to function. When we checked the drawings and we checked the technical data, all the technical data that we received said it should have worked. When we went down and did some measurements on vital parts, the measurements that were there didn't match the drawings that were provided.
So we have the complications of the LNG, but we also have the complications of not getting a simplistic system right as well. Would that be correct?
Well, if that's your opinion, yes.
Would you say that an anchoring system is quite a simplistic technology?
Yes, and came as big a surprise as I was surprised as anybody, the fact that we had the issues that we had. So and it was very, very disappointing that in February it hadn't been signed off or it hadn't been indicated that we had this issue. So
in which case you would share my opinion then?
I would partially share it, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just going on along the lines that about delays, Glen Rosa, 802. When is that still on target? When's the target date for that?
September next year.
And the parts you have taken off the Glen Rosa to build the Glen Sannox that we heard about, is that going to delay that?
No.
So
in the case of the gypsies, we've ordered 4 gypsies. So as the committee member indicated there, we now know that that one will not work on the Glen Rosa, so it will be fixed at the same time as, or in and around the same time as the Glen Sannox will be fixed. And any issues similar to that will be fixed.
So were the control panels taken off the Glen Rosa as well, or was it just the anchor bits that were taken off?
There's been various pieces taken off. It was easier to get, you know, the long lead items. It was easier to take something off the Glen Rosa, but I believe it's been documented what we took off. And if I can maybe step forward, one of the things that we are doing, we'll be doing in the coming weeks, will be lessons learned sessions. I don't mean an hour or 2 hours, I mean days. And our sponsor has offered has offered us a facilitator to sit down with us, look at objectives and what we were trying to achieve, and everybody will be involved in those lessons learned, not just Ferguson employees. We'll have Lloyds there, we'll have CMAL there, we'll have CalMac there, and they will have their input on the lessons that have been learned over the last 7 years.
Okay, hold on. Douglas wanted in first to follow up on the anchor, then I'll come to the Deputy Convener, and then we'll see where we go.
Thank you, Convener. And it's just really a brief follow-up on the anchor issue. Was that a warranty issue or was that a design issue? What was the
It was a design issue.
Design, so there was nobody to go back on, it was just...
No, it was a design issue.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Convener, Michael.
Just on the issue of 208 in the timeline of September 2025 that you provided, what's your degree of confidence in that timeline?
If I'm being completely frank here, about 90%. There has been some impact in the people being seconded to Ship 1, and I don't mean the workforce. I mean like engineering. We don't have a vast engineering department. Like for instance, a couple of them. On the electrical side, we have 2. So we've really got to put our shoulders to the grindstone and get it. And one of the things we haven't done in Ferguson is the utilisation of other shifts, like putting full shifts, full second shifts, back shifts on. That will be done. That will be done shortly. We've just appointed a night shift manager, which we've never had before, and we'll be putting people on night shifts. So things like electrical cable pulling, which you need people out the road, not in your way to try and do it. We'll put things like that on, and that's what the plan is setting out to do.
So just on that 90% then, so what are, and you've maybe mentioned part of it's around skills,
Yeah.
What are the principal risks to that September 2025 date?
It's getting people to believe that they can do it in a certain time frame. One of the things we have not been good at, including in my tenure, is giving dates and keeping them. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a plan that everybody buys into. We don't have passive resistance when people agree to dates and then just go off and do their own thing. It will be more structured. We will be breaking the ship into smaller parts, zones, giving managers of zones, which we didn't do before. We had a manager over all of the ship. So we've got senior people who are going to look after small parts of the ship. It's, you know, we said it's not new. Shipbuilding isn't new. It's just a matter of getting a plan and a design, and we've got the design now, which we didn't have before. We've got the model. We can look at the model. We can install LNG in the proper time, so it doesn't have the impact installation-wise. We can get that. We can get that signed off long before we ever got it signed off here. You know, on Ship 1, on the Glen Sannox, you know, we were finding things as we went along, as opposed to like the anchor. If we'd have found out about the anchors in the February trials, it wouldn't have been an issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, yeah, and it's helpful. On the remaining 10 months for Aero 2,
Yes.
are there key points in that 10-month period where you'll have to make a decision on whether September 2025 is a go or not a go?
Yeah. So previously we've never had those gates where we reflect on the progress or the non-progress we've made to that point, such that we can make informed decisions and give informed decisions to this committee on a quarterly basis or an interim basis if we think something's going wrong. The Chair has set up various committees, one of which is an Ops Committee. We have an Ops Committee meeting every 2 to 3 weeks, called by the Chair of the Ops Committee, and we report to them as well. So we have a monitoring group even within the shipyard, so it's not life according to just the CEO or the CFO. There's various groups that we report to on the board as opposed to just the board. So that's where we're going to be monitored. So in short, there will be gates in there, major gates like switchboards being switched on, engines starting, basin trials, those types of things, which are common, but we didn't have some of those milestones to recognise maybe where we were going. And I really don't see You know, I was asked a question, should we put LNG in the second ship? I definitely think we should put LNG in the second ship, because the LNG is working fabulously. You know, much to our great hope. It's like an electric car. When LNG is on, it's like an electric car. And what it gives CalMac the opportunity, if one of the systems isn't working properly, they can switch to the other, so they don't have to go into dry dock to get it fixed. So it's like a hybrid car. You can switch from one to the other.
Okay, and my final question then is that, are there any external factors that worry you about achieving that September 2025 date?
One would, internal, external, is the retention of people, keeping people, because for maybe the same reason that we're maybe having a bit of difficulty getting a replacement or a permanent person in this position, it's retaining people because the future of the company. And then externally, you know, we're all drawing from the same gene pool. You know, you've got a bigger employer up the road. You've got an employer across the river. You've got people in Saudi Arabia who are going to build a big shipyard in Saudi Arabia who can fling money at them just like they do for the football. So that's definitely an external factor, keeping and bringing people in.
Okay, thanks.
Just before I go to Douglas, can you just clarify? I'm so confused now. Maybe it's because I've been looking at this for too long. I was told LNG was an easy fuel to use and it had been used before. There was nothing wrong with the design of LNG ships, and that's why it was chosen for the design for the Glen Sannox and Rosa, and that came from both CMAL and also came from the owners of the yard at that stage. Right. And now everything seems to be turned around that it's a very new technology. I think my new technology goes back to before these ships were being built, LNG was being used. So it's not new technology, it's just we've had problems installing it. Surely it would be the right way. Andrew wants to come in.
Yeah, no, I'll answer that if I may, John. It's not new technology globally. Most of the installations are not in the UK. In fact, this is the first time any ship has been registered in the UK with dual fuel, gas and diesel. And the regulator quite correctly takes a cautious approach to that regulation. Also, the skill set in the UK is very wanting in terms of that fuel, even though we had great difficulty in get some expertise to come from overseas, to come to the yard to undertake some help for the business in terms of what we're actually trying to do. So it's not new technology, but it is new technology in terms of the certification process in the UK. That's the issue, or was the issue.
Okay, but it seems to be the build technology that we've had the problem with, if I remember rightly.
Technology?
The build technology. We had couplings all over the place, pipes everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. The planning, and you know, the yard has gone through its own major restructuring issues in terms of different owners, etc., which hasn't helped things in terms of having a consistent planning document all the way through.
So it's a question always of building to your strengths. But anyway, Douglas, you've got some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I was going to ask about the 14.2 million investment that the Scottish Government announced in July. Just wondering, you know, where we are with that. I think I heard some of the trade unions had concerns that, you know, that investment might not be in place quick enough for some work you've been tendering on. So just for an update on that, please.
The 42 million's in the public domain. You know, the unions who we work very closely with, obviously there is a sales hopper which is large and wide. Our ability to bid for 100% that work is somewhat limited, given our background and experience. We will be releasing the capital expenditure as and when over time to fulfil not only the order books, but to get the yard into a more efficient mode of operation so that we can bid for the work and achieve the price points that prevail in the marketplace.
But in terms of that capital investment, maybe a question for David, is there a plan to have that money spent and committed, or?
Yes, there is a plan. So we've actually broken down the 14.2 million into different areas. So firstly, there's a pot of money there for capital expenditure, which is just obsolete equipment, equipment that isn't working, is needing upgraded just now, and that is a result of the fact that there's not been a capital pot for the last 5 years. You would expect normally, maybe £1 or £2 million every year to just keep upgrading. So that's a catch-up. That's the first pot that really should happen straight away. Then there's a separate pot which we really need to accelerate 802 to make sure that's delivered as quickly as possible. And then the third pot is for the development of the yard and the future of the yard, more significant upgrades. So there's a specific set of pots there that each piece of equipment has a different lead time. So we will be going through Public Contract Scotland to start getting quotes.
Okay, but I remember David Tideman being here before talking about a new plating line. So I guess none of that. How much of that 14.2 would be for that sort of improvements? When would that? Because I remember the lead time for that was very long.
Yeah, I mean the lead time was, I think, 12 to 18 months. I think on that, and then you're up against other shipyards across the world that have more money to accelerate those lead times. So we've changed that from the business plan that David Tideman put in last year. So it's completely different.
So out of that 14.2 million, how much is for the upgrades to actually try and win work going forward?
You've probably got about £4 million that's obsolete equipment.
Yeah.
So the rest, the 10 million, is a combination of what we could do now and what we need for future bidding. So I would say probably in the region of £8 million. Probably half of the 14.2 million is for future work.
Okay. And in terms of, it's maybe a question for John or Andrew, in terms of how many full-time employees do you have at present within the yard?
35.
135. And I'm looking at
Yeah, but that's
contractors as well. How many?
That's everybody clocking in.
It's about 290 Ferguson Marine employees. The rest, we've probably got about 430 odd in the yard, which is subcontractors.
Okay, and over, I guess, your plans for the next 2 years, how do you see that workforce fluctuating? Because obviously there's one vessel now complete, handed over, great. Obviously some of that workforce will then be working on the Glen Rosa. So how do you see that workforce planning going forward for the next 2 to 3 years?
So we're actively, and I can't mention some of the people that we're talking to, but we're actively negotiating at present with a major subcontract for work. We've got 2 other potential customers that are a little bit further to the right, but the Deputy asked me about how we're going to achieve the 10. We're going to achieve the 10 by keeping a lot of these people around and putting them on second shifts and putting more people to it. But if anybody was not required, it would be subcontractors. It wouldn't be out of the 290. Mm-hmm. That's the model that most shipyards are doing now. They figure on a core group, and then if they have to go up, they go up by the means of subcontracting. Then if they have to let people go, the subcontractors get let go. If you have a say we have a core, just for figures, a core group of 300, and we go up to 400 or 430, and we stay there consistently, then it's incumbent on us to try and bring in permanent people to bring it up. I worked for the Irving Group that are in Halifax now building the frigates, and prior to that it was in St John. And in St John, what they did was they hired too many people. So when they had a downturn in the work, they had to let local people go. When they moved the business to Halifax, what they did was they came up with a figure that they felt were confident they could go 5-10 years with, and increased it with subcontractors. And then when that, say, 1,700 went to 2,000, and it was consistently 2,000. They brought 300 people back in, and I would believe that was the model that we would want to continue with.
No, it's just the reason I ask is I'm looking at a social media post from David Tideman from last week, and he said now the challenge on how the government pays for all the yard overheads and management costs, now that the costs cannot be charged 100% to 2 ferries, and then only Glen Rosa is occupying the yard. So I'm just trying to work out, how, as a yard, you're sort of budgeting for less income from the Scottish Government for those 2 vessels going forward.
You can answer.
Okay. So we have what is known as under recoveries at the moment. So anything that's not charged to 801 or 802 or any commercial activities. So that would be temporary downtime, cleaning up the yard. That is then not charged to a build cost of 801 or 802. So they're under recoveries. They're a separate pot that we charge the government every month. That pot of money will be expected to go up because 801 has been delivered. So we have to look at different ways of reducing that under recoveries pot. One of them is to second staff to other shipyards that have the demand. And we have a flexibility arrangement there where we've been doing that for several years. So that can temporarily allow us to reduce the under recoveries while still having the flexibility to bring the workforce back if we win additional work. We will have to look at the whole structure and look at the overheads. There are certain things that we can do that we've already started work looking at. I'm looking at the full overheads of the yards to see where we can utilise and bring down that under recoveries.
What sort of things are you looking at out of interest? And in terms of under recovery charges, how much is that per month that gets charged to the Scottish Government just now?
So it varies. It depends on. So for the first where are we now? 7-8 months of the year, we've probably been in the region of about £1.5 million for the year. Some months it's £200,000 or £300,000. We actually were next to nothing the previous month because we had so much work. Everyone was fully engaged and employed on 801 and 802. Afterwards, after 801's now delivered, and now as we look to the commercial opportunities, that can then go past £500,000 a month. So we have to look at all our overheads, all our contracts, and see where we can get better value for money. So, for example, we've just renegotiated or put out to tender to Public Contract Scotland for a piece of work for 802. That, if we used the incumbent, was going to be a significant amount more. We put that out to tender. We've now awarded that contract, and that's saved a significant amount of money. We'll do that across the board, looking at contracts and overheads. And
in terms of your forecasting under recoveries for end of next year, what are you forecasting that to be?
For the end of this financial year?
End of 25, sorry. Once Glen Rosa is handed over.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of doing the forecast for the budget for next year, so I don't have a figure for that yet. What I will say is that we originally forecast somewhere in the region of between £8 and £10 million overall for under recoveries this year. We are not going to be anywhere near that. As I said, the significant amount of work on 801, 802 that has been gainfully employed so that we don't have to use under recoveries. And we've also had commercial opportunities as well that has allowed us to reduce that. So we won't be anywhere near that this year.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Sorry, I'm just looked at the company accounts from last year. I think the salaries for the employees was 23 million, roughly. works out about £50,000 a head on the employees that you've got, including your subbies. If you've only got one boat and you have 400 odd people working on 2 boats, what's going to happen? I mean, I just don't understand. I don't understand how much it costs to keep the lights on in the shipyard if you're only working on one boat, and how you're going to balance the under-recoveries at under 10 million when your wages alone are 23 million. Perhaps you could explain that to me.
Well, the under-recoveries are the original under-recoveries of £10 million was anything that we thought would not, if we did nothing, that's the amount that we would have to, that we wouldn't be charging 801, we wouldn't be charging 802 or any commercial opportunities. So that would us only be delivering 801. We wouldn't have any commercial work to charge that. And then clearly at that point you would have to do something to reduce that. Wages and salaries is probably one of the biggest cost base in the company, as is most companies. So you would look at that if there was nothing happening. We have already reduced that 10 million down. It will be half of that probably this year. It will start off at 200,000–300,000 a month, and then for the back end of the financial year, it will be higher than that. So, as I said, we've got to look at all our overheads, we've got to look at our wages and salaries, we've got to renegotiate contracts.
So, the total money required currently to keep the lights on, salaries, all the costs for the yard are what a year?
I don't have that figure exactly to hand because, well, for example, we have 27 vacancies at the moment, so our salary bill will naturally go down. And obviously we've got additional costs with wage inflation, national insurance increasing. So the national insurance alone will probably £250,000 based on our current wages and salaries bill. We're currently in the process of doing a forecast, a reforecast that I'll have to put to board, and then we'll make decisions off the back of that.
So 40 million's not an unreasonable figure if salaries are 23, which you'd say was roughly your biggest cost.
It's not an unreasonable figure. Yeah.
So are you going to get 40 million from the government for Glen Rosa next year?
If what, in under recoveries, you mean?
No, you're going to get paid 40 million for the work that you're doing on Glen Rosa next year. I thought we'd paid a lot for these ferries already. Yeah,
so we've currently built about 96 million for Glen Rosa. We have about 54 million left to go for the 150 that we've currently forecast. We're going through a replanning forecast at the moment. I'll have to go through the whole forecast, look at where we can save money, and also I'll have to look at the risks. So if I go back to Glen Sannox, I did a forecast in February, which I didn't actually like the forecast that I first had, so I put in a lot of risk to that. I put in delays. I looked at the overheads that were in, so I gave a view of 145 to 149 million on the basis that we were delivering in May 24. I had risk built in there for a delay of up to 3 months. So as it got to August, that 149 was at risk. And then after it went past August, I was using up the majority of the risk. We were trying to look at other ways that we could save costs and bring that down. I'll have to go through that whole process with Glen Rosa as well. But it's not just Glen Rosa, it's what else is out there. We're currently bidding for SVRP. We have other, as the Chair said, we have other potential partners as well. So that's a full exercise that we're going through at the moment.
Okay, I think the next questions go to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask you about the role of subcontracting, and in particular the Type 26 frigate work BAE Systems and future subcontracting work. Well, I'd like to ask you about where things are at with that subcontracting
We're
work.
negotiating with
Yeah.
them on contracts. That's all I
Okay.
can say just now.
Okay.
We're,
Do you have an endpoint to that, likely endpoint?
yeah.
Because I think the government said in July that it was at the final stages of discussions between BAE and yourselves about the frigate programme. So we're now nearly in December.
There's been hurdles between us and them. Look, we're at their beck and call. We have to wait for them to have units ready. I can't go into too much detail on it because we've been asked not to go into too much detail on it.
Right.
But we're very encouraged by the results we've had in the last week.
Okay. I mean, if I was to ask you what kind of themes around the barriers are there? Is it sign-off? Is it technical specification? Is it no?
It's getting units that fit our facility.
Right.
It's probably the biggest barrier we have because they want to build them inside. They don't want to build them outside.
Right.
So we've got to look at what units we can build in the methodology they want to build them in. Plus, to go back to your question with regards to the improvement in the yard, we've got to start improvements. So we've got to try and balance both of these at the same time, keep people employed, get work in the yard and try and improve the yard at the same time. So we've got kind of three balls in the air at the one time.
Okay.
But we're very encouraged. I would like to say we're very encouraged by the progress we've made, particularly in the last week.
Right, okay. So does this come back to the issue that David Tideman explained to the committee about the need for a plating line and a grand block, I think it is, a ground block? I mean, is that £14 million of investment, is that to gear you up to take on more subcontracting work?
We're trying to model the yard off and buy the equipment that will give us our best bang for our buck, such that we've got partners around this area that have overcapacity on certain pieces of machinery. One of the things that we've got to do is make sure that we have the same IT technology that they do as well, so we can transfer information. It didn't take a genius to figure out that we needed to take a shipyard that was stuck in the 80s into the 21st century, right? Any half-decent shipbuilder would walk in and say, look, we need to improve, but we've got to spend it wisely. We're a small shipyard trying to be, the only commercial shipyard left in the Clyde. We're trying to be the best in this area and then the best in Britain. I've seen quotes being best in the world. If we could be best in Britain, we'll be doing very, very well. I think that should be our first objective is to get the confidence back. One of the board members said, our reputation has been damaged, and it has. We've got to get confidence back in the yard. We've got to accept that we didn't do things right. It's easy for me to sit here and be the last one here and blame everybody else. I'm not going to blame everybody else. We've got to look to the future. We've got to look to learn that you can't start a vessel until the design's finished. You can't start a vessel unless you have a plan. You can't start two vessels at the same time. You don't bring in all the equipment all at the one time and make yourself having to rent another warehouse. You do it the way the rest of the world is doing it, and you do just-in-time delivery, just-in-time. We don't have an area to store plates, so what we've got to do is we've got to have a partnership with a plate supplier and demonstrate that plate supplier what plates we need and bring them in a timely fashion. I worked in Vancouver, and Vancouver didn't have a much bigger yard than we have, and that's exactly what they did. They partnered with a company that would bring the plate in when and if they needed it.
Okay.
So you need a plan in order to do that.
Right. So are there still uncertainties then in terms of the scale, I guess, and the pace of that investment, which is holding back a decision on the BAE contract? Or is there certainty that you'll have what you need in place at the right time to fulfil that subcontract?
It's a good question, Mark. And, obviously there's been a lot of things happening in the commercial and the military shipyards in the UK. And I mentioned, not by name, but I mentioned the Belfast situation, which the government in Westminster is trying to secure a future for that business with another party. That deal hasn't gone through, but clearly the destabilisation of that business, who were heavily involved in marine and other issues to do with the Falkland Islands, they're all swimming in the same pool as some of the more established players, especially in the military arena. And I think some of the players, especially, I don't like to mention names, but some of the players are, considering what the risks are, given the contracts which are currently in that yard, that they may or may not acquire, especially if that shipyard group is going to be re-headquartered in another jurisdiction in the EU. All these things bring about a sort of reforecasting assessment of risk in terms of how these players move forward. The positive news is that the naval shipbuilding business is the most buoyant it's ever been in the last 50 years. But that's not to say there's a separation between the naval, the military part of the market and our area of the market, because some of these big players require a supply chain for subcontracted work. And there's a bigger picture here in terms of the sustainability of commercial shipbuilding in the UK as a supplier to some of these bigger military contracts. And, that's sometimes that a lot of people forget or ignore. It's all about joined-up thinking in terms of what's actually going on just now.
Okay, thanks. It's obviously challenging context to operate in.
It is, but
I really appreciate that, and I think everybody on this committee, wishes you well. Want to see the business expand and grow going forward.
We appreciate that.
Can I ask you about subcontracting more generally? And again, I think David Tyman at the time said that 801, 802 were more complex than a Type 26 frigate. I think he said. Maybe that's something you agree with or you disagree with, but is there something here about the size of yard, the expertise that you have, your place in the market, that points to maybe subcontracting or, smaller vessels, being a, more of an opportunity going forward for the business than perhaps very complex, bespoke engineering contracts, 801, 802, that just,
John will give you a more. Am I on the microphone?
I might be a bit controversial here. I don't find it a particularly complex vessel. I just don't think it. I don't think it was planned and designed properly.
Right. It just ended up.
I think Ferguson was well capable of producing this vessel. Are capable of producing it, but obviously you want to get a series of ships. So if you take SVRP, you take 7 ships. Generally, a shipyard will say you're at ship 3 before you start making money, and you have a gap between ship 1 and ship 3 such that you can find out all the snafus that you have there and you fix them for ship 4. I was involved in building 9 frigates, and we were on the 4th frigate before we really actually knew what we were doing. Now, I'm not trying to compare anything we're building to compare to a frigate. This is not as complex as a frigate. And an ex-colleague of mine, Andrew Hamilton, actually commented when that came out. But it's a dual fuel vessel. That brings its own particular difficulties to it. But we have to find a niche market. We, the board, feel that we need maybe 2 or 3 income streams, three strategies. So when one's not doing quite as well, or there's not as much to do there, we can lean on the others. So the yard, if you split it into the yard, you have the big shop, you have the slipway, you have the shop up at the top, and you have you can have a ship there getting ready to sail. You can have a couple of ships here getting built. In the shed, you could be building pipe work for offshore or wind farms or whatever, and you can be doing some naval work in the yard. So that's a mixture we've got to try, and that's the 3 or 4 balls that we're trying to put up in the air. We're trying to get the people to think differently, because Ferguson really were one-offs before, maybe 2 one-offs and 2s, but you really want a series of ships, right? And I think what a lot of people are doing now is they have a series of ships, and what they do is they give you 2 + 2 + 2. So they have an opportunity to pull out after 2 if you're not doing well and give the 2 to somebody else. And I think that's something we're going to have to venture into. But if I can make the point now, one of the things that we are going to do is try and do a joint venture with an established shipbuilder. We haven't chosen anybody. We've been speaking to different people. We need to get out. We need to get out of the business of designing ships. We need to go to somebody who has a catalogue of ships, and you go, and somebody like CMAL comes and says, we go, okay, there's 6 ships similar to what you're looking for. Pick one. And there's a design that's already proven. So the trials and tribulations that we went through with the design process and all that is gone. That risk is gone, right? And you bring them in, similar to what the Belfast Yard. I was there when we signed a contract with Navantia, and the reason for that was to bring in their expertise for project management, get advice on how to lay out the yard, so on and so forth. And I think we've got to be humble enough to realise that we need to do the same thing, to take that leap that we need to take us in the arena to be competitive in the being competitive in the commercial market, as you all know, I believe, appreciate, is totally different from being competitive in naval yards. It's 2 different animals, right? What we need to do is we need to get bang for the buck for our sponsor, get ourselves to a point where we're an established business. And for me, as a person, the first thing we need to do is break even, right? Break even so we're not costing anybody any money, and then look at trying to make money.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Quite a few follow-up questions here. Go to Kevin first, followed by Bob.
I'm very interested in what you have said, Mr Pettigrew, around about the design or lack of design. Is that the major failure of this project, the fact that the design wasn't there?
We started before the design was finished. We should have finished the design before you. It's not unusual to start a ship before it's completely finished, but I think if I look at the history of it, I can only comment on stuff that I read in the business and the enterprise. And from my experience, we started too early, and we started both ships at the same time. If the history I've been told is correct.
You said that your ambition was to take a yard from the 1980s to the 21st century. Is that lack of design scenario held that back, or do you think you're now on the way to bringing that?
No,
yard
I think
into the 21st
with
century?
the monies that's been allocated to us, if we spend it wisely and spend it with the right equipment and the right technology, and partner with and take advice from other people, I think we can get there. I don't think we will get there.
Okay. You also mentioned a difficulty earlier on, and I'm using your phrase, around about passive resistance. Is that passive resistance to change, or is this passive resistance because people have been put from pillar to post during the course of all that's gone on?
I think you just answered your own question, to be frank. The 2 points you made are very, very valid. I think with the change of management, the instability of the management, we're not talking about personalities here, we're just talking about people moving and leaving the company or leaving the enterprise. That must be distressing for people. But we've got a lot of people in there that have worked 20, 30 years there, right? And some people like change, some people struggle with change. And we've got to change. There's no doubt about it. We have to change.
And does everyone that's working in that yard at this moment recognise that that change is required?
I believe so. I believe so. They want to see the change. There was nobody, like David has a person who reports to him, been working there 6 years, and when it was announced that we were going to get monies to improve the yard, she was nearly crying, because it was a relief to her. And it was a relief to our partners. You're asking why maybe it stalled a little bit to get additional work. They were looking and saying, were we going to be around in a year? Were we going to be around in 2 years? And that's what the chairman was alluding to.
So a lot of pelters have been thrown for
really?
for good reason in some regards.
Yeah.
From what you're saying, a lot of that is down to the fact that the design wasn't there. You talked about that lass, crying at the investment money. What's morale like amongst the workforce? Are they positive for the future? Are they up for it, basically?
Yes. The ones that have stayed are up for it. The ones that have stayed. And look, if you're a young person sitting there with a mortgage, you've got to think differently. If you're sitting there and your mortgage is paid and you don't have bills coming in. But I do believe we have some really, really good young talent. Actually, when the Deputy First Minister came to visit, the 3 people that showed her around were under 30, and she took a picture of them and her on the gangway, and I think the average age was 31.
So in terms of your sales pitch at this moment for other work, are you using those young folk as part of that pitch to show that they're up for it?
100%.
Thank you very much, Mr Pettigrew. Thank you, Convener.
Right, we're off to Bob next with his questions, followed by Douglas.
Thank you, Convener. I've listened to all of this with great interest. I suppose potential partners with Ferguson will also be listening to your evidence, and competitors as well. So these evidence sessions that the Committee has been so diligent in scheduling for the Committee is really important to the future well-being and prosperity of Ferguson Marine. There was one thing that was said in an answer to questions right at the start about there was a senior manager in charge of completion of the entire vessel, but that actually hadn't broken down into sections of the vessel. So there seemed to be a lack of accountability, if you like, on the shop floor, for lack of a better description, to making sure each individual section of the ship was nailed, and if it wasn't, you could identify who was responsible for that slippage. Is that quite unusual within the shipbuilding industry? It seems crazy to me that one person would be directly responsible for the completion of an entire vessel, and I'm pleased to hear that management accountability structure has been changed. But was it Mr Pettigrew, when you found out that that wasn't already in place, was that a surprise to you?
Somewhat, yes. But you said it's not in other shipyards. If you go up the Clyde, they have a delivery director. But we're not a naval shipbuilder. We're a commercial shipbuilder. We have to do things differently.
Okay, so I suppose the point I'm making is, was it self-evident to you, Mr Pettigrew, this should always have been the case, that there should have been a senior manager responsible for each particular section? It was
the introduction of proper project management procedures that was required. We didn't have project managers, so that we have project managers that are a singular voice away from operations. If you go to operations and ask them for an end date, they're always going to give you the optimistic view. If you go to somebody who doesn't has skin in the game, but has to report to me on where we're going to be, you're going to get a different answer. So you have to compare both answers to see where you actually lie.
Right, and if that system had been in place years ago, do you think we'd be the same situation just now, or would performance have been better?
I would have to say no, we wouldn't be.
I suppose the reason for asking this, Convener, is because we want all of you to turn Ferguson Marine around. We want you to win more orders. We want you to diversify. And I'm trying to get to put on record about where Ferguson Marine is now that would give confidence, not to us as a parliamentary committee scrutinising, but to future investors and future partners, because we want you to win all those contracts. And the troubles that you've been through, can this potentially make you better prepared, fitter and leaner to win contracts because of the problems you've been through? And how can you assure us you're getting it right now?
Well, we definitely know some of the mistakes of the past, and John alluded to the key elements of the shipbuilding business that we would like to work with other parties. I call it the intellectual property end of the scale, new propulsions, new designs, where we can rely heavily on the intellectual property of other partners. There's discussion going on with some of these partners in terms of how we work together with them, whether it be through management contract or indeed some form of equity situation. Obviously, we've got to prepare the business for the future, not only in terms of giving value to the current shareholder, but finding other opportunities with other shareholders to try and deliver what's required for the Scottish economy. You know, I'm not wedded to state investment in assets. We clearly we're working to a situation that we want to improve how we acquire new capital for the business and how we hit the necessary returns. Ferguson Marine is the last commercial shipyard on the Clyde, as everybody knows, but we do have some sort of friends in the marketplace that we've been talking to about how we could work closely together to achieve a better outcome for the business, one which would hopefully prepare the business for some sort of other investors involving themselves with the enterprise.
Okay, then finally, Convener, right at the start, I think, other than the structural need to modernise the yard, reputation and confidence come up time and again has been the biggest barrier. Now, clearly, the biggest way to rebuild reputation and confidence is to meet these new deadlines set within the cost envelopes that are forecast, and that has, let's bluntly, been the challenge for years now. But on the basis, given you a fair wind, that you nail this, what can others do? So not Ferguson Marine, what can others do to help rebuild reputation and confidence and to be a good friend to Ferguson Marine? Because we want to see this with success. So not internalising all the things we know you need to do, you have to be accountable for as an organisation. What can others do to assist?
Well, I'm just going to give you an argument on some of the statements you've made, but I'll give you one green shoot. David's been in the business as finance director for about 12 months. He gave this committee a financial number on 801 in May, 7 months ago, and that, although we haven't washed up completely, that forecasted number is still the number that we are actually working to. Now, that was 7 months ago. Now, we couldn't have said that before, 2 or 3 years ago, that we'd be confident in that. But the building up of the skills and expertise of people in the management, the help of John and other key people who have joined the senior management team, and indeed the board. You know, Simon joined the enterprise about 12 months ago. Getting these key people into the business to help us plan forward. And a lot of the people we deal with are ex-Ferguson Marine employees, whether it be CMAL, CalMac, or other enterprises up the Clyde. We do have friends. There's a lot of people that are willing us to succeed, and we have to prove ourselves. That's definitely, we have to deliver on time, on schedule, and show the market that we can actually pitch for new work. And we've got quite a lot of projects in the sales hopper that we're actually working on. Some are more short-term than medium-term. And we have received work, subcontracting work, from one of the biggest naval shipyards in the UK. So we've been working very, very close to them. And that's providing engagement, you know, even between myself and the very senior principal there, in terms of dialogue, getting some advice and securing more subcontract work. In fact, some of the people in the Scottish Government have been very, very good in helping us out establish these communication channels to make sure they understand our strategy and where we're going in the future.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miller. Thank you.
So you complete?
Yeah, I'll
perfect. Douglas, I think you've got a question, then I'm coming to Monica.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just to go back, John, we heard you've been offered a contract extension to spring next year, and you're not sure if you're going to take that yet or not. Do you not fancy doing this role full-time? Or? Oh, you are doing it. All right,
I am
okay.
doing it. We're just ironing out the details. He just takes too long giving me stuff. No.
I have other masters.
I have other masters. No. I am going to do it.
And did you not fancy
just so you
doing...
know, my dad used to run Inchgreen. Right? You know, I'm from Greenock. I'm from the Port Glasgow area, right? And I'm proud to say I'm from there. Okay, I live somewhere else, and honestly, I don't fly back and forth every weekend, contrary to popular belief, right? I'm here because I want to see the yard to succeed. And the 14.2 million is about the 30 and the 35-year-olds. It's not about me.
Mm-hmm.
It's about building a future for the young people. And I'm not trying to sound like a politician here, but that's what we're all about here. Right? That's why David has joined the company on a full-time basis. That's why this gentleman's taken the chairman over. That's why he's joined the board. Right? We want it to succeed. So I am going to stay.
So do you not fancy doing it long term, or? And you mentioned
my family situation. I would do it full time, but my family situation doesn't allow that to happen.
And you mentioned the travel, so it's probably your chance to put on record now what your sort of travel arrangements.
I've seen my family 3.5 weeks out of 8.5 months.
So you're basically living almost full time in Scotland then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cabina.
Thank you. Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. I promise I want to talk about the future as well, but just want to go back on a couple of points that we've heard today. To John Pettigrew, it was quite fascinating to hear you say that this was not a particularly complex process, or in terms of what was being asked for in terms of the ferries. So I just wonder if you can maybe just explain what you mean by that a little bit more, because for lots of people across the country, what they see are ferries that were massively overdue and way over budget, and to them that feels quite complex and quite messy. So can you just explain what you mean in terms of not particularly complex?
So I think it was best explained to me. What was the word he used, remember? It's very congested rather than complex because of the size of the tank. Monica, have you been to the shipyard?
I haven't, no, unfortunately. Not yet.
Right, so...
Is that an invitation?
There's an open invitation to everybody here anytime.
Thank you.
Right. If you would come down with me, and I'll take you on Glen Rosa, and I'll show you the size of the LNG tank and the space that it takes up. So against the Seaforth, which is in the Calmac fleet, very, very similar sized engine room. It's better laid out because it doesn't have this huge big tank that takes up so much space. So what it is it's not complex, it's very congested. There's a difference between complex and congested. It's a very, very congested engine room space. And I think you asked about it in regards to design and planning. The design and planning, and the Chairman was talking about the key events that maybe we could have done better. The design and the planning of it is absolutely paramount. It doesn't matter whether it's a frigate or a trawler or a patrol boat or a landing craft. If you don't have a plan and a design, you're doomed for failure.
Thank you. So just to pursue that a little bit more then, so in terms of the specification for 801 and 802, in your opinion, John, do you believe the specification was right? Was it appropriate, or was it over ambitious?
I can't really answer that because I wasn't here for the discussions on exactly what the overall end use of this vessel was. All I know is that if you go on the Glen Sannox now, I know it took too long, and I know we let the community down by taking that long. It's a fantastic vessel. I've been in lots of vessels. If you go and look at the passenger areas and you look at the engine room now, it's a fantastic vessel. That's all I can say to it. I can't comment because I wasn't there in the negotiations of what the specification was. All I know is when I came here, there was a vessel needed to get finished.
No, thank you. I appreciate perhaps the limitations of your knowledge on that. Wondering if I can just put the question to Andrew Miller as chairman, because I think it's really important that we're confident that all lessons that can be possibly learned have been learned. So on that issue of specification, Andrew, are you able to say if the board is satisfied that the specifications were appropriate and the correct ones, or were they over the top or over ambitious?
At Ferguson Marine, we build ships. We build ships to a specification, a design that's given to us, and we build them.
Up for any challenge. So a different question then. So in terms of the specification that you were asked to build to, has every aspect of that been fully achieved?
Well, clearly, with the timetable that wasn't met, with the budget that wasn't met over a protracted period of time, obviously there is lessons learned, and it's to make sure absolutely that we learn these lessons and apply them on the second vessel.
Okay, but in terms of Glen Sannox, everything's been completed that was in the original design and specification?
Well, I reiterate what John said. At handover, there were people in tears from our company and other agencies that were on the bridge when it was handover. It was a very emotional time, and that ship is an exceptional piece of kit. Very high quality. It performs well in excess of expectations. It is the first vessel to be registered in the UK under the hybrid fuel system that we actually have. These are phenomenal achievements that are actually drowned out by the negativity of the past. I can understand that. We are looking to the future, and we are fixing a lot of things, including the people at this end of the table, in terms of the quality and the skills that we actually need. And we look to the future with enthusiasm.
The final sign-off is by CMAL. As you know, we did a two-stage handover. We did a sign-off by the class societies, MCA and Lloyds, and then a few days later, it was signed off by CMAL. So if they had a perfect opportunity, if they thought something was definitively wrong or they weren't happy with it, much as it would have been a disappointment to us, they were happy. The captain of the vessel was actually on a handover, and he stayed a day and a half late to be the person that put up the ensign at 6:15 that evening. That's how proud they were of that vessel.
Thank you. I think you understand why I was just wanting to double check that everything's been completed, and in terms of any snagging issues, it sounds like there are none. So that sounds like
no. Look, we're here for the long haul. If something happens, we're here for the long haul. We're not going anywhere, and that's why it's good to buy at home, so you don't have to go to a foreign country to get somebody to come and fix something that's wrong. We're partners with CalMac and CMAL. We're not adversaries. We're partners.
Thank you. Now, I did say we'll talk about the future, so just wanted to come on to the small vessels replacement programme. It was mentioned earlier on, I think, by David Dishon, and we've heard a lot about potential partnership working. So at this stage, are you able to say more about Ferguson Marine's ability to submit a competitive tender and how important securing this contract is for the yard? You've talked a lot about the workforce and the young workers coming through, which is great to hear about. So just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, we're still in the running in terms of the procurement process. We're one firm of 6 that's still in with a chance. The timetable is not controlled by us. It's controlled by another entity, and we, as John said 3 months ago, were bidding vigorously. The big issue for us is the fact that I call it one point in governance for the whole enterprise in terms of looking at the communities on the west coast of Scotland. If you think of them and focus clearly on that, there's 3 parts of the troika, as I call it. There's CalMac, who operate the ship, CMAL, who specify on behalf of the Scottish Government, that one point of contact and governance for the communities in the West Coast of Scotland is probably underplayed because it splits into ministerial responsibilities. So we have one asset, Ferguson Marine, that was bought to save jobs for the future, which was a great motivation. But we have another contracting authority who chases, in some regards, 40% of the points. They chase the lowest possible price. Now, it's very difficult for commercial shipbuilders in the UK who operate at half the margins of military shipyards, half the margins, to compete where 40% of the marks are awarded on price when the assets, the three assets, are owned by the same principle. So in terms of the objectives playing against one another, it makes it quite difficult for a commercial shipyard in the UK, not only Ferguson's but other people, to achieve the winning points to secure that work, which is very important for the future of Ferguson Marine. So, dealing with that is problematic. There's a good reason. I don't want to seem anti-global competition, but there is a reason why some jurisdictions win contracts, because of the cheapest price. And when you're in a country where you have 40%, 6% domestic inflation, and you fix contracts in any currency you want, one has got to presume there's a level of subsidy playing in these organisations which are competing with our enterprise here on the Clyde. And I'm not for subsidy, but we want fair competition in terms of how we pitch for this new work, and to make sure there's some joined-up thinking, to make sure that when you own various assets, you understand the overall objective, the one point of governance, which is supplying reliable and consistent ferry services to the west coast of Scotland. To support these communities, both in terms of social access, but also in terms of economic access for their development of some of the industries there, so they can export.
Thank you. And if I could just come back to John briefly. I believe that one of the requirements for the vessels under the Small Vessels Replacement Programme is that they have to be electric, and we know there's been issues with Glen Stanix and Glen Rosa owing to the LPG fuel system. Do you have any concerns around that, or again have lessons been learned that make you feel quite confident to handle that specification?
They're two different beasts altogether. It's a battery electric type vessel, and what you would do is go to a systems expert on that, and they would guide you on what systems to put in, and you'd have a system integrator that would actually integrate the ship. That would maybe be another key element that we may have been missing on the two vessels that we currently have in the yard.
Okay, and why do you think that was missing?
Well, it's the intellectual property end of the scale which we're talking about. We're having working relationships with partners who are well ahead on the new technologies globally that can give us some advice to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, and that's what we're undertaking.
Great. And just final question. I promise, convener, I can't see you, but I'm sure you're probably waving your pen at this point. I'm just going to declare my interest as a member of the GMB union, and also I'm a member of the RMT parliamentary group, just because we're talking about issues around the workforce. You've given us quite a lot of anecdote today about how people are feeling across the organisation. Can you just give us a couple of words to tell us how you engage with the workforce on a regular basis, and what that discussion looks like, and particularly in relation to the future of the yard?
Are you addressing that to me, Monica? Or
if
David?
You can answer that, yeah.
So, one thing David does, he doesn't sit in his office as a CFO. He comes on the vessel with me regularly, and I would challenge the committee to go down and ask anybody if they don't know me and haven't spoken to me on a regular basis. Like on ship, on the Glen Sannox, I was on the Glen Sannox 45 hours every day. I don't wear a suit. This came out the cupboard. I wear a pair of jeans and a T-shirt and a boiler suit. Similar to the principal up in BAE, you know, when Andrew and I met him, he came in his office in a boiler suit. You've got to engage with the people. You've got to tell them what's happening. You've got to have town hall meetings. You've got to allow them to come to your office if they want to come to your office to have 5 words. You've got to be approachable. And if you remember that union, you can ask the union members in Belfast. When I was there, I was exactly the same there in Belfast.
But also, you know, at the board meeting, we have a regular slot for the GMB.
Yeah.
You know, it used to be Alex and John. It's just one of them now at 15 minutes where, you know, we answer directly as a board their reservations or their questions, you know, surrounding the enterprise. And, you know, apart from the informal level of contact around the yard, I don't get onto the ship as frequently as John because I find great difficulty in fitting my boiler suit. But people were very approachable. They can ask us anything they want, very approachable. And that's what happens. If they've got a grouse, if they've got a reason that they want to raise with the board, they can raise it directly with the board of directors in John's presence, and that's what we do.
And I have a regular Tuesday meeting with the union rep every Tuesday. Not today, tomorrow.
I'm sure they'll forgive you today. Well, thank you for those answers. And just a clarification, Convener, as a hand back to you. In my earlier questions, I asked Andrew Miller about Project Domino. Looking at the paperwork I have that's been released from the Scottish Government, it appears to be a code name used by the Scottish Government in March of this year, so it may only have been used internally, and perhaps we can ask the Scottish Government about that separately, just to clarify that. Thank you.
I'm sure we can ask them separately about the Project Domino. Just before we leave the small vessels thing, and I'm going to then go to the Deputy Convener, David Timon, when he gave evidence, said that building small vessels in Scotland would be 25 to 30% over what it would cost to build it anywhere else in the world. Right or wrong?
It depends where you're comparing yourself to. You know, as a
there are other shipyards around the world. You know, there are 6 other shipyards, five other shipyards in it.
Okay.
My question is he right or is he wrong?
He's right. We would be increased in price. I can't give you the exact figure to that.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Convener, and then...
Thanks. Just in terms of going forward in the future, I'd be interested in getting your view on, and you've touched on this to some degree, but I'd be interested in getting your view on the future shape of the company going forward. So do you see the future of Ferguson Marine going forward as being a standalone company, as it is at the present moment, or going into a JV arrangement with another partner, maybe in the intellectual side of the business, where you could offer some specialisms to them in partnership, or, as you also mentioned, Mr Miller, the issue of equity, where there's a potential for other external partners to come in to take an equity share in Ferguson Marine as a way of shaping the business going forward?
What we're doing, Deputy Convener, is trying all these options to see which is the best in terms of for the sustainable future of the yard. Nothing's out of the arena at this current moment in time. We have had some discussions with interested parties, which I can't name, in terms of how we would see the working relationship going forward. On the current list, under the SVRP programme, there is an organisation who has the Vietnamese subsidiary company, who are one of the 6 bidding parties, and it's very clear to us that these organisational structures that give the customer the best possible price but blend that intellectual property component are part and parcel of the way forward. The whole soup to nuts model in terms of Ferguson Marine, of starting with the metal and the rivets and creating a whole ship, is not part of the modern way and how the world market builds ships at this moment in time. Yes, they do in naval shipbuilding, but the average margin on naval ships is twice the percentage of commercial operations. So we've got to be smart in what we do. So I think political jargon is nothing's off the table currently, because we're pursuing a lot of the relationships that we've alluded to in the past. And that's the way forward. That's the way the industry is going.
So would it be fair to interpret from that that the existing structure is not sustainable in the present international market in shipbuilding?
If I can answer that in a, well, not obtuse way, but I would say the whole focus on building 81 and 82, quite rightly, to serve the communities in the west coast of Scotland, that took most of the focus. What was really underdeveloped was the longer-term strategy, either on acquisition as a state-owned enterprise, or probably for about 5 years. If you look at the board papers, there was very little regard to setting the strategy for the future and the whole intellectual grunt behind that, which has taken us about 12 months to get up to speed in terms of what we're going to do with the asset in the future. Clearly with support of the ministers involved.
So you feel as a board now that you've got a better grip on that future strategy?
A better grip, and I must say, one of the distressing things I said was the fact in 12 months when I was first at Ferguson Marine, I had 4 ministers that I was responsible to. They all kept changing. Now, the current minister said I was being unfair because she was the first one and I couldn't count her twice. But we do have, literally very good ongoing support from the Servicing Department, and indeed the Minister who is willing to help us and have meetings and talk to people to advance our cause. And that's great credit to the lady who occupies that position. And I enjoy very much working with her, the same way as I did when I was the chairman of Prestwick Airport for 7 years. In fact, you were one of the ministers that I reported to, I think, in year 3, 4 and 5 before the DFM took up the position. So, yeah, I'm very pleased about the working relationship. But it's a tough assignment, probably one of the toughest assignments I've had in my career in terms of, turning around organisations, taking state assets like Prestwick Airport. And, that enterprise has been profitable every year for the last 5 years under the auspices of, state ownership. It is possible. It is possible with the right amount of application, drive and energy. It is possible.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, I've got a few and a comment. I think it's very interesting, having first visited 801, as it was then, with wooden windows and dummy stanchions on the back to secure it to the harbour, which had to be taken off, and bulbous noses and all the rest of the things, to see it come into service 6 years after it was first launched. I think that's interesting. I've also seen Jim McCall, Tim Hare, David Tyman, and now you, John, in the chair, interestingly, all saying the same thing but slightly differently. Tim Hare swore that taking on a new warehouse in Glasgow would save the day. Next to the yard would save the day, and that he'd know what the inventory was that he'd taken over. And I'm still as confused, having been doing this for 6 years, where all the issues lie. I think one of the issues that does concern me is that we'd ended up paying £82.5 million against a £96 million contract for 18 stage payments on the 2 boats, where 15 of them had been paid and one of the boats wasn't even built. So I'm slightly confused where we're going with this, and I'm slightly confused who's learning the lessons, but there's lots of lessons to learn there. I have a quick question, probably to David. When Glen Sannox was undergoing its sea trials just recently, I'm assuming you had the vessel insured. Could you tell me how much it was insured for, please?
Yes, so under the contract, with Scottish Government, we have to insure it for the build price, for the full build price. So we regularly have to top up the insurance, which is again eats into my risk on that. So we've had to insure it for the 150 million build price.
David Timon told us it would cost £48 million or nearly £50 million to replace it. Over-insuring, under-insuring, you know, where are we? What would it cost to build that ship today if it had been done properly?
I honestly couldn't say what what that would cost, but obviously it wouldn't be 150 million. I think the replacement value that they looked at when I first looked at insurance, the replacement value was something in the region of 70 million. But as I said, the contract with Scottish Government is you have to insure it for the full build price. So up until last Tuesday, it was insured for 150 million.
Well, if I was a marine broker, I probably wouldn't have taken that risk on building for maybe 3 times the value it would cost to replace the vessel. So well done finding somebody to do that. Andrew, you made a comment about David Timon's evidence being inaccurate at certain stages, which you'd had to write and apologise for. Could you please provide the information to the committee relating to that, because it would be helpful for us to see whether the reports given to the committee by David Timon were actually factually correct.
Sure. On one occasion, in terms of the...
I'm happy to take them in writing,
No, I'll just try and give you an example, but that's okay. I've answered the question. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think we all hope for a successful outcome. I'm just not sure that I can see it. So unless there's any other questions there, I think I'm going to leave it there. And thank you for giving evidence. I would actually ask in future as well, just when it comes to giving reports to the committee, it's helpful to have as detailed reports as possible. When we're getting the reports on the problems, I don't think we were aware of the anchor chain incident in any of the reports that we've been given. Perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps I didn't read it properly.
Again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That concludes that session. I would ask members to be back at 11 o'clock for the next session. I suspend this meeting till then. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. We're now moving on to agenda item 3, which is an evidence session on the Land Reform Scotland Bill. And today we're going to hear from a panel of legal experts, and the focus will be on part 1 of the bill. I'm pleased to welcome Malcolm Coombin, President, Senior Lecturer at Law in the University of Strathclyde, and Callum MacLeod, who's online, a solicitor in practice in Inverness. We understand, Callum, that you're speaking in a personal capacity today as a specialist in this part of the law, rather than on behalf of your firm. I'm sure you agree, you nodded, so that's fine. And I think I also welcome Rhoda Grant, who's online, and will get a chance to ask some questions at the end. Just remind members that I'd like to declare an interest in a family farming partnership in Murray, as set out in my register of interest. Specifically, I declare an interest as an owner of approximately 500 acres of farmed land, of which 50 acres is woodland. I also declare that I'm a tenant of approximately 500 acres in Murray under a non-agricultural tenancy that I have, and that I have another farming tenancy under the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 1991. I also declare that I take on grass lets occasionally for my cattle. We've allowed about an hour and a bit for this, and we're going to go into questions. And I get the first one, which is the easy one at the beginning. Malcolm, just ask you a little bit about your experience in land reform, just so people are aware. So start with you, Malcolm, and then come to Callum.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. Yes, so I've been a land reform watcher for a while, I suppose. I did my undergraduate dissertation when I was studying for an LLB at the University of Strathclyde on the first land reform bill, and then continued after that. I took a traineeship and then qualified into the law firm Todds Murray LLP, who no longer exists, so I've got no conflict of interest there, unfortunately. Then I took up an academic post at the University of Aberdeen. Shortly after that, I became an advisor, an external advisor to the Land Reform Review Group. Some of you might remember that ad hoc Land Reform Review Group that existed. And then threaded throughout my own legal research, own projects and what have you, I've developed a bit of a specialism in land reform. I teach a property law course to undergraduate students. I've taught honours courses in the subject, and I also teach a housing law subject at the University of Strathclyde as well. I might add that in addition to Callum, I am also appearing in a personal capacity. Strathclyde know I'm here, but I am appearing in a personal capacity. And I should also add that I am one of 7 committee members of the Scottish Land Fund Committee, so technically I'm a civil servant in that capacity in terms of the grant awards that are made by the Scottish Land Fund. But yet again, not speaking in that capacity, and don't regard that as any particular conflict. But I certainly won't be speaking about anything that's embargoed or privileged in that capacity.
Thank you. Callum.
Firstly, thanks for the invitation today, and apologies I can't be there in person. So I'm a rural property solicitor. I act and advise for landowners and community groups alike, and I have a special professional interest in community ownership and community buyouts. I've advised on around 30 or so community buyouts, and as stated earlier, whilst I'm not giving evidence on behalf of my firm, certainly my evidence is based on my own professional experience of land reform and community ownership.
Thank you. Again, another simple question from me. We seem to do land reform about every 10 years. Is it time for further land reform? I don't know what's happened to the screens. Is Callum still there? Yes, yep, I can see everyone again. It was a temporary flicker then. We seem to, just in case you didn't get there, we seem to do land reform every 10 years. And my question is do we need it again, and will the bill improve transparency and the rights of sustainable development for communities and ensure the adequate provision supply of land? Very simple question.
As to who goes first.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was just looking, because the way it's going to work is that when I ask a question, if either of you look away, I'll probably come to you first.
Okay.
But neither of you did. So, Malcolm, you go first, followed by Callum.
There you go, the sort of legal training there of determining to maintain eye contact there. But yes, I should also say thanks for the invitation, so don't seem ingracious. Callum said thanks and I didn't. Yeah, I don't have a view on that. I'm not necessarily here to push any particular agenda in that sense. I'm relatively agnostic on the substance of what the bill tries to do. My own view is that I'd like it to work as a piece of law when it comes out, and I'm quite happy to give evidence and the views around that. I'm quite happy to offer some thoughts about whether provisions might be workable and what have you. But broadly speaking, you can have land reform as an end in itself, or you can have land reform as a means to do something. And in terms of whether land reform is needed as an end in itself, the Scottish Land Commission has been doing some work about concentration of land ownership. So they might argue that that's pointing towards an increasing need for diversity of land ownership. You've maybe got other views in terms of the importance of economies of scale and that kind of thing. And I know you've had evidence from representative groups to that effect. I offer no view on whether land reform as an end in itself is needed. What I might offer a view on is that we've got two Land Reform Acts from 2003 and 2016. There have been some issues with certain of the existing provisions to do with community rights to buy. Callum's probably got some war stories or at the coalface stories he can share. I've been more sort of comfortable sitting behind a desk offering critiques, and I was instructed by Community Land Scotland to do a little bit of work in relation to some of the buyouts that may or may not have worked and what happened when court challenges happened. And that's been published on Strathclyde's website. If I can pass it to the committee if that would be helpful. But in a way, that's been compartmentalised off and taken away by the separate review of the existing community rights to buy, which I know the community land team is looking at, and whether that should have happened first, whether it should have been concluded. Again, I'm not necessarily offering a view, but it maybe means that some of the issues around maybe tidying up aspects of the community rights to buy are not squarely, they're not on all fours with the text of the Land Reform Bill that you have before you. So, in that regard, again, that's another way for me to, unfortunately, strategically sidestep the question. I'll maybe pause there and see if Callum wants to come in and regather my thoughts if there's anything else, but happy to take any follow-ups as well. Callum.
Now, Callum, I don't know if we're confusing the system, but I think everything is done for you, so you just have to sit there and start speaking, hopefully, if broadcasting's got it right. So, far away.
Hopefully you are hearing me. So, yeah, to a degree, I'm going to sidestep part of that question. I mean, I'm not here to give evidence so much from a policy perspective, but if we look as a starting point, as I understand it, government, but perhaps to a lesser degree, Parliament supports greater community ownership. So if we take that as a starting point, and again, to a degree, government and or Parliament is trying to support greater diversity of land ownership, then from that perspective, I think it's going to be generally accepted that as a policy aim to support these two things, land reform then is going to be an ongoing process that does need to be looked at from time to time. So, for example, if we go back 10 years, you mentioned 10 years, which takes you back to the Land Reform Review Group. quite a number of the recommendations of the Land Reform Review Group were never taken forward in any substantive way. I'm making no comment of whether that was right or wrong, but it just goes to show that it is very much an ongoing process. Speaking from my own personal professional experience, what I am finding is that in acting for community groups, they are finding it harder and harder to acquire land, especially under the various community rights to buy. And I think it is accepted that the community right to buy, community rights to buy, arguably, are in need of reform. I fully appreciate, as Malcolm said, that there are now proposals underway to review the existing community rights to buy, but I do believe that the community rights to buy are long overdue a review. I do think that should have been done first, and I think this bill would have been a perfect opportunity to look into that. There are potentially some issues that won't be addressed. For example, the extended community right to buy, I'm sure we'll discuss later, that might be impacted from a lack of review of the existing community rights to buy measures. And I know, for example, Community Land Scotland, with some input indeed from myself, have published some detailed proposals advocating some fairly modest reforms to the existing community right to buy, and I think there'd been certainly merit in looking at them, and I'm happy to forward details on to the committee. But to answer the question, yes, I do believe that there is a need for looking at further land reform. What shape that should take, is not for me to certainly comment on. And final point I would add is, whilst my focus in answering this question has been on the community rights to buy, which I'm quite interested in from a technical legal perspective. You mentioned transparency surrounding land ownership and whether the bill will achieve that. Well, I do think to a degree the bill will achieve that, and that clearly is part of the wider land reform process. It's not just about community ownership, of course.
Mark, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, was there anything that you were surprised to not see in the bill, given that, passage of time since the last Land Reform Act, there are perhaps new issues on the table now, like natural capital investments, and I don't know.
It's an interesting question, and I'll thank Callum for mentioning the Land Reform Review Group there. I promised I didn't put him up to that, but there were a few points within that, and there's been discussion for a while about compulsory sale orders. I know the Scottish Land Commission, David Adams, one of the former commissioners, was particularly keen on that proposal. Obviously, there's no sign of that here. Prior notification of sale, just in a broad sense, the bill might, as a byproduct, lead to certain amounts of prior advertisement of land transfers when it could engage the lotting provisions. It's maybe a bit about faced about that in terms of how you get to that, but there's an element there. As regards natural capital, whether this would have been the vehicle for it, I'm not sure. There are other, there's been the wildlife legislation relatively recently, and I know there are. That is one of the key new dimensions in the land market. I say as someone who is more a legal practitioner than a land agent, but that's clearly a difference to the situation in 2003, whether it's the most recent trend or big thing. Possibly that's something that, could people have been a bit more alive to it? Sure, but again, whether it's this bill in terms of what it does, the one thing I would say in terms of and other aspects of story, I was not expecting lotting. I wasn't necessarily expecting lotting, and I wasn't expecting it to look at the transfer from so in terms of what was being regulated, I was sort of more expecting it to be the recipient that was going to be given a stress test and given it a bit of a shake in terms of whether it might be in the public interest for them as an individual to receive it and sort of look at what else they perhaps owned in terms of what the result of the transfer to them would be, rather than looking at the situation of someone who was transferring might be. It's possibly a technical point, happy to come back to it again. There might even be human rights aspects of why that approach could have been a little bit better than the other approach. But be that as it may, this is what we've got here.
Yeah, thanks. Callum, any thoughts? Was there anything missing in this bill?
Yeah,
or anything that surprised you, I guess?
Well, I mentioned earlier certainly reforming and reviewing the current community rights to buy, which we're finding just now, the late, for example, the late application provisions now are essentially defunct under the 2003 Act. There's also the two newer community rights to buy for abandoned and neglected land and rights to buy for sustainable development. Again, they've been proven to be quite very difficult to use, and I really think a review of the existing legislation was needed. Like Malcolm said earlier, compulsory purchase, something around that. I was expecting something like that to be in the bill. As to natural capital, it is still very much a developing and emerging sector, and I tend to agree. If we're talking about regulation of natural capital, I'm not sure this would have been the place for the place for it. I do think there might be some interesting things to come, just in terms of the community engagement management plans, and I think that might shine up a bit more of a light on natural capital plans for certain landowners, and that in turn will allow communities to engage with landowners, in particular in relation to community benefit. So, for example, I know the Scottish Land Commission is doing some interesting work in looking at community benefit structures in terms of communities benefiting from natural capital, and certainly I think the land management plans will certainly increase opportunities for engagement. Hopefully
we'll come back to land management plans later on, because I know a number of committee members have got interest, including myself, so thanks.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for stopping that before you trod on somebody else's toes there. Monica, I think you've got the next questions.
Yes, convener, right on cue. I want to ask about land management plans. We honestly haven't rehearsed this before you came along. So both Callum and Malcolm, we know from your written evidence some of your thoughts on this, and so far the committee's taken a fair bit of written and oral evidence on land management plans. We've heard a number of concerns from witnesses, including around cost and administrative burden, lack of reference to crofting, and some concerns around commercial sensitivity as well. So just want to give you a chance to say a few words about what level of detail should be in the land management plans. What do you think would be appropriate, and is there anything that's currently missing from the bill in that respect? And I can see Callum, so I'll come to you first. I think I can see the back of Malcolm's head from here.
In terms of the level of detail that should be in the plans, I mean, I do generally support the idea of the land management plans. I think the level of detail, of course, is going to vary from landowner to landowner. You mentioned crofting there. I mean, I think I would expect maybe if you're specifically talking about a crofting estate, a large crofting estate, then I think the level of detail that might be expected of a large crofting estate obviously is going to be very, very different probably to a non-crofted estate, given that property tenants are the ones who principally have the maybe the occupancy rights. So I think it will vary from landowner to landowner. I am aware there's been some concerns maybe expressed about some things being commercially sensitive. You know, for example, future plans for sales and succession, and you know, I can see why these concerns are there amongst landowners. In terms of costs, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. There has been figures like, I'm not well placed to advise, but I have heard figures like £5,000 plus in terms of cost for producing these plans. I guess the question, maybe that's coming to the question on compliance. You know, the fine is roughly the same as the cost, and there might be concerns surrounding that specifically. And in terms of the detail of the plan, I would like to see things surrounding. I mentioned natural capital earlier. I think that would certainly benefit both landowners and community groups alike. There tends to be a few myths as well, I think, surrounding, you know, the money that can be made sometimes from certain natural capital projects. So I think, you know, that type of thing, I think, would be appropriate for the plans.
And do you have an opinion, Callum, on whether that level of detail or requirement, for example, on natural capital, should that be something that's on the face of the bill, or should that be addressed later in secondary legislation? Sorry, Callum's on mute again.
Is Callum there?
Yeah, I don't actually have a view on that, Monica, no.
Okay, just looking at your written evidence, Callum, in terms of the land management plan threshold size, you're saying that this size is arbitrary and requires further explanation. So, given we're at stage 1 of the bill, what explanation would you like from the Scottish Government, and you know, what is your view on the threshold size?
Well, I do find, you know, as a starting point, I do find it quite curious that the lotting provisions, for example, are applying only to landowners to sales of over 1,000 hectares. You know, and that seems to me slightly inconsistent. And I would have thought, even for simplicity's sake, that actually having the same level, same threshold for both would have made more sense. It just seems. It seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect there, given that, you know, the lotting is arguably interfering with individual property rights, and yet it's at a lower threshold than the land management plans themselves. So I find that a bit curious. I think as well. I mean, obvious point perhaps, but in some communities, clearly, a landholding of a smaller scale may however reflect a greater concentration of both land ownership and ultimately power. And you know, the Scottish Land Commission have, you know, undertaken work that looks at other considerations rather than just, you know, naked acres, naked hectares. You know, local monopolies, for example, how much employment is connected with a particular landholding, and so on and so forth. And it does seem to me that these type of considerations are relevant as well.
Thank you. I want to ask Malcolm if he agrees with Callum. I'm just noting from Malcolm your written evidence. I think you're saying your inclination would be to reduce the trigger value to 1,000 hectares as well. Have I got that correct?
Yes, you have. I'll circle back to some of the other stuff that Callum mentioned earlier, if that's okay. But in terms of this point, absolutely. But it's a bit of a sort of finger in the air in terms of whatever figure you choose, I think. And it's not some. Well, I say that as someone who teaches in a higher education institution rather than is engaged in land management directly. But there will have to be a line somewhere. What I don't necessarily see outside looking in, and again, this is maybe my own ignorance in relation to land management or whatever, is I'm not sure as to why there needs to be that difference between the 3,000/1,000 if you're an island and the 1,000. I just think it could be easier for all parties if you had a degree of uniformity, and I'm not sure that I've seen anything particularly convincing. But I mean, there may be an islands-related reason. I know there's obviously islands legislation for that, but I just think it could perhaps be a little bit easier to have a single figure for all sort of regulatory effects. But I have no strong views, and I don't think I'm qualified to say what that figure should be.
No, that's helpful, Malcolm. And do you think it would be helpful for the Scottish Government to maybe clarify some of the rationale behind this?
It certainly wouldn't be harmful.
Okay. Just sort of final question to you, Malcolm. I wanted to talk about natural capital, but that's helpfully come up already. In your written evidence,
hold on, Monica, we lost you. We got in your written evidence. If you'd like to continue your train of thought from there.
Apologies, Convener. I'm not pressing any buttons, but I've been muted and unmuted a few times. But I'll go again. So just sticking with Malcolm, then, in your written evidence, you've highlighted the concerns about the proposed scheme for composite holdings that may lead to some difficulties in application. Could you set out what your concerns are, please?
It's complicated. That's the gist of it. And I think there needs to be some kind of means so as you can stop someone patchworking the holdings, such as to dodge regulation, essentially. But I think there have been some concerns about the way that the definitions have been put together. I know a retired solicitor, Neil King, has commented on maybe the way it's been informed by the Register of Controlled Interest in Land regime, and it's just quite tricky to get your head around. Whether now I say this with complete respect to the Bill team because they had a difficult task, but as I say, it's just whether there are other ways, and also it's the query around whether it's only going to be contiguous holdings as opposed to, and that's to say if you had one sort of lot of land here in the west and another in the east, but then you had another holding that was relatively proximate but not actually abutting, would that holding not be included in the composite scheme? Now, as I say, it's tricky, and I'm not sure I've certainly not come here with a drafting solution, so apologies for that. But yes, there are perhaps accessibility issues around it, and then there's the effect of it when it actually comes to pass.
Thank you. I mean, it does feel like this might be an area of the bill that needs further work and further amendments. But just to maybe reinforce the point, do you believe that the Scottish Government need to be clearer in setting out their aims and objectives in terms of what land management plans, what really is the purpose, what value will they add, who will they benefit? Do you think we have do you think we really understand that at the moment based on what we have right now?
So, coming back to the land management plans and maybe tying in with some of the stuff that Callum had said earlier, I mean, land management plans seem to be obviously driving towards land being used in a more sensible, pragmatic way, and there are some landowners in Scotland who have certain obligations that they need to aspire to, and they would be community groups that have already negotiated a Part 2, Part 3, Part 3A right to buy, or a Part 5 under the 2016 Act. They will already have acquired land in the public interest. They'll have sustainable development built into what they do. They'll have local accountability and what have you. So also having certain sort of nice things, that's a very sort of simplistic way of describing it, putting obligations on other landowners that might not otherwise be there seems to be something sensible to consider in this time where we're considering the climate crisis and various other issues around natural capital or whatever. So I appreciate, though, that there will be a regulatory step that needs to be taken that isn't there currently. And that comes back to the very first sort of aspect of the question which you put to Callum initially. So when you go from nothing to something and you're introducing whatever level of detail there is, I think you need to make sure you don't burn any goodwill too quickly. So I think it's important to pitch it at the right level. And also, speaking of that, Callum pointed out the idea about, like, if it's going to be 5,000 and the fine's also 5,000. There's a sort of environmental law concept or sort of problem or wicked problem of the idea of a rational polluter. If you've got someone who saves money by polluting as compared to the fines that are being levied, you end up with someone who doesn't bother complying with the law. So there needs to be a degree of interaction between whatever penalty applies and whatever costs are expected. Also, and again, sorry to shunt back to something that was earlier in the conversation. Callum's no doubt got tons of things he wants to say. You mentioned about where the level of detail should be, whether it should be in the face of this bill and whether it should be in regulations. Now, I know delegated lawmaking has been an interesting discussion point of late, and I think I was on the record in relation to, for example, the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, some of the provisions around secure tenancies, 1991 Act tenancies. I think they should have been on the face of the bill, but then were saved up for regulations, and I'm not sure that was the right way to do it. But in relation to the finer details of what is to be in a plan, I think I'm quite relaxed about that being delegated legislation. I think that sort of level of detail, maybe that should be something that's thrashed out in a specified, sort of more focused consultation exercise in relation to that, assuming that was able to run. So that was a wide-ranging answer, and I apologise for that. Happy to try and trammel some of my thoughts as required.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Callum and Malcolm. And I was noting down rational polluter. That sounds like that will be helpful for my endeavours on ecocide law, but I'll hand back to the convener on that point.
Perfect, thank you. Can I just say that time is always against us, and I think we're on question 3 of very many, or the third panel member, committee member who wants to ask questions. Say, I'm just going to look for brevity. Just both of you slightly confused before I come to the deputy convener. I think you're both suggesting that management plans and lotting ought to be at the same level, not. Unless I've got it wrong. What I can't work out is, were you suggesting it needs to be less than 1,000 hectares, or are you suggesting that 1,000 hectares for both was right? Very briefly, Malcolm, and then Callum.
I have no view.
You have no view? Callum? Sorry, we didn't hear you.
I don't have a view on that either.
Okay.
It just made sense that there was some consistency.
Okay. Keeping it simple. Deputy Convener, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Just sticking with the land management plans, having considered the provisions in the bill, are you sufficiently clear enough about what the intent of land management plans are?
To the extent you can glean that from the bill, I mean, the only thing that is going to definitely need to be in the regulations around it is a duty to engage and a duty to consider any requests by a community to lease land. Unless I'm mistaken, I think that's the only active steer that is in the skeleton of the bill. Otherwise, I mean, there are other nods to important documents, the access code, deer management plans. So again, that gives you something of an idea as to the flesh that might come later. Whether it could have been sort of elaborated on, perhaps. I'm not sure what that drafting would have looked like at this stage. It would probably need someone else with a different expertise to me to tell you exactly what it would be. But I think the tenor of what it's getting at is not something that discomforts me at the moment.
Okay. Callum?
Yeah, I don't have much further to add to that. I understood the tenor, certainly, albeit, yeah, clearly it could have been more detailed, but I did understand the tenor of what I was trying to get at.
Okay. And I'm taking, Malcolm, from your earlier comments, you think that maybe some of the detail would be better dealt with in secondary legislation around the land management plans. Is that correct?
Again, I'm comfortable with that in this context, yes.
Okay. The 5-year time frame that's intended around land management plans, do you think that time frame is the correct time frame?
Again, possibly a bit of a finger in the air moment here. I don't see any particular reason why not, but there may be others who are having to deal with it, who would say that's quite a sharp turnaround, perhaps. So, yeah, again, possibly not the most satisfactory answer for me, but I think it's more for people who disagree with it to explain why than anything else.
Okay. Callum, do you have a view on the time frame? Because we have had some evidence to suggest that the time frame for a land management plan, 5 years, is quite a short time frame, given how long it can take to take forward land management.
Yeah, I would defer to those that experience in preparing these types of things. I mean, it seems like a reasonable timescale, but I don't have the qualifications to really comment on that.
Sure. Okay. No, I do appreciate you're a lawyer, not a land manager. So, sorry, Malcolm.
I suppose the one thing I might add is 5 years does marry up with how long a community interest in land stands for in relation to Part 2 of the 2003 Act. So, if a community body has to face that churn every 5 years to get registered community interest alive, there might be, but others might say that's a false analogy. So,
okay. So let me look at another aspect then. So in land management plans, if they were, say, they are for 5 years, and there are obviously obligations in that plan that the landowner is responsible for taking forward, do you think if the land changes hands, it's sold and purchased by someone else, they should also inherit the obligations that are set out in the land management plan if it was before the date of when it was due to expire?
So, a very interesting conceptual question, because in property law terms you wouldn't expect to take on the obligations of your predecessor in title unless there was some kind of registered title condition on the land or something else that's publicly showing on the register. So I guess that would mean that the land management plan would have to be suitably publicised in a way that would allow anyone to have fair notice. And also you'd probably need to have some kind of scheme akin to the Lands Tribunal oversight for variation and discharge of title conditions to deal with any sort of chance. That's in Part 10 of the Title Conditions Scotland Act 2003. You'd probably need to have consideration of that, and that's not something I've particularly thought of. So it's a right good question, if you don't mind me saying so, but I'll give that some thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
Callum?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Malcolm there. It's hard to see how you can make it binding. It would be against the general principles. I guess property law that that type of obligation would automatically be binding on successors. I think it may depend, of course, on the nature clearly of the land management plan as well. So I do think it's an interesting concept, though. I do think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it may go against the existing perception of how property law is managed or how property law is traditionally taken forward. That doesn't mean it can't be changed. And what I'm thinking about is that if you've got a community who've been engaged in a land management plan with a landowner, a significant amount of time has been engaged in working with them to identify what would be their priorities, then to find that the land is sold 2 years later and that the new owner comes in and decides that actually we're going to do something completely different. It makes communities feel quite disenfranchised and quite a worthless process.
If I could come back in, I completely agree with what you've just said there. But there are ways in law to have sort of designations over land that will then continue, whether it's a Ramsar site, whether it's some kind of tree preservation order, or whether it's a triple SI, and that would then stick around for any incoming owner. But the other thing, and again, without meaning to undermine the question, but what my reading of these provisions on the face of this bill are, is that penalties only apply for not producing a land management plan. There is nothing here in relation to not complying with a land management plan. Whether that's going to be fleshed out at the regulation stage, we'll wait and see in relation to that. So if someone comes in as a new owner and doesn't like the current land management plan, they're not going to face any penalties if they don't abide by it. So they're just going to have to wait until the new one comes along. And I'm not sure, actually, and apologies for not knowing this off the top of my head, whether it would just be a new owner at that point has to do their land management plan, or whether they get to wait for the other one to expire. But it, as I say, possibly makes the question a little bit odious, unless the regulations then say existing land management plans bite, or land management plans bite in a different way. Because, as I say, the penalties, to my reading, only apply to the existence of the plan, rather than the terms of that plan being complied with.
Well, the other way to look at it is what's the point of having a land management plan if the landowner chooses not to implement any of it?
Quite.
It produces an R1 in 5 years' time to make sure he doesn't receive a penalty. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Just before, because I know Kevin wants to come in just before we leave that. I mean, I'm just thinking that land management plans will be based on the principle of in many cases, people running a business which will have developed the land management plan to dovetail into their business and meet with the community needs where possible. So if your business is farming, and I've declared that I am a farmer, my land management plan, if I was required to do it, would be about farming. If I sold the land, somebody might buy it to plant trees to meet the government's objective to plant trees, which might not meet the community's need. So by making a land management plan enforceable for a period of time, are you going to distort the land value? And if so, how are you going to compensate it? I say that as a surveyor as well.
Yeah. You'd have to think about that closely, but also in terms of, again, moving it to a different issue. We've already got Part 4 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 in terms of the community engagement exhortation, which is supposed to apply when you make such a big change in relation to a land use that's going to affect the community. So it may be that that's catered for elsewhere, and it's more a case of tightening that up than trying to deal with it here. But yes, if you were to make someone who comes in sort of unable to change anything? Would it skew the value, etc., etc.? Yeah, that's something that would need to be thought about closely.
Callum?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the point made. It does need careful consideration. But one other observation I just had, perhaps harking back to a point I made earlier, that, you know, in terms of compliance with the land management plans, it does strike me, you know, a failure to comply. Could that potentially tie in with, for example, the community right to buy abandoned or neglected land? Or indeed, you know, the right to buy for the purposes of sustainable development, and it could be, you know, quite a relevant factor if a community body wanted to try and take forward an application under one of these community rights to buy as a result of a landowner failing to comply with the land management plans, and it's, you know, an observation as to whether the two pieces of legislation could perhaps dovetail a bit better.
Sorry, I see it. We're going to get into non-compliance, I think, later on, but I just see interfering with the land market will come at some cost, and I'm trying to figure that cost out. Kevin, you've got some questions you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Previous witnesses have suggested that there could be a connection between land management plans and local place plans to meet community needs. What do you think of that, please, gentlemen? Malcolm, please.
Thank you for the question. And once again, and I'm possibly sort of sounding a bit of a stuck record, I'm not sure we get many strong views on that. It does strike me that it would be sensible to have some kind of integration with those documents, but obviously you're going into a different regulatory sphere than the land governance directly. It's more the planning side of things. So happy for some kind of synergy to be set up. It would just need to work appropriately and make sure that you didn't have duplication of effort and all that kind of thing. But yes, that's probably all I've got to say on that.
Okay, Callum, please.
I'm going to sidestep it as well. I mean, I agree that it makes sense that there's some level of synergy between the two, but it's not an area of my own particular expertise.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. The next questions come from Mark, and I think you've got a series of questions.
Yeah. So can I ask you about those who can allege a breach of a land management plan? So I think, Malcolm, you were saying there's a closed list of those who can clap on the owner of a large land holding if there's thought to be a breach. Do you think the balance within the bill right now is correct? Is there pros and cons in terms of having a bigger list, a smaller list?
So this is the new section 44E, which has got the closed list. There are benefits to having a closed list in terms of managing workload and things not growing arms and legs or whatever. But also, if you are restricting who is able to clipe, as I put it in my evidence, then that will obviously have an effect in terms of hamstringing what can get to the Land and Communities Commissioner's desk. And also, unless I'm very much mistaken, I'm pretty sure the Land and Communities Commissioner is not able to do anything of its own motion, so it has to wait for a report. So when you have that combined with quite a tight list, that's necessarily going to restrict what can happen. Now, there are benefits in having a short closed list. It brings certainty, it brings a degree of people knowing, and also it will act as a sift, and people will have to there'll be a degree of quality control, and also it might prevent duplication and all this kind of stuff. So I can understand the argument in one direction, but I can also understand the argument in another. I suppose, again, as a starting point, maybe that's fair enough, but I'd want to be agile to potentially adding to it if it seemed to lead to a logjam.
Yeah. Callum, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have views on the correct balance here. I mean, I think Malcolm summarised it pretty well in terms of the pros and cons, clearly, and it might be something that needs to be looked at in the future, clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. I just go back to that rational polluter argument as well, Malcolm. And you mentioned, the register of controlling interest. So I think there's a similar fine of about £5,000. I think at the time that we discussed that in Parliament, there was a view that £5,000 is not a lot of money, but there's a reputational concern. Obviously, if somebody is hit with a fine like that, that might have other implications. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I'm not aware of whether that trigger under the register of controlling interests regulations has actually been applied.
I don't know that it has.
So I don't know if there's any kind of cases that have come up on that, but I'm not sure if it's a deterrent or not right now.
It's a good point. You'd hope that someone might feel that public shaming, if that's the correct way of describing it, could lead to a change. But then again, if someone just wants to tough it out and they're happy to pay the relatively small fine and get on with it, then that would be that. I know in my evidence I drew attention to the level of fine for private landlords for not registering, and there's also HMO compliance. You're looking at 50,000 rather than 5,000, and that was changed in 2011. And landlord registration only came in 2004 in the antisocial behaviour legislation, and then the fine was upped in 2011. And there's been human rights challenges to that regime that have been unsuccessful, in terms of the landlord not being able to charge rent after there's been issues around registration, and that scheme's been fine. Fine in the OK sense as opposed to financial penalty sense. So whether 5,000 again is the right figure, probably for other people to decide, but I just wonder if it could be a little higher, just in case someone does try and tough it out.
Callum, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, well, quite clearly, if the costs for producing the plans are going to outweigh the fines, then that's going to be a real concern. Certainly, I know for some large landowners, the public shaming will be enough of a deterrent. But I think there is a reasonable concern that for other landowners that will not be a sufficient enough deterrent, and I do wonder whether there's opportunities of looking at cross compliance in terms of agricultural subsidies, etc., and that might be a better way.
Yeah. Okay, I think other members might want to come in on that as well, but I just wanted to ask you a final question from me, and it was about, we were talking earlier on about thresholds. But there's been, I think, quite a consensus in evidence about the importance of sites of community significance. So, not saying, okay, well, here's a threshold, you either fit within it or you don't, but actually, there are sites that are of huge significance to communities, particularly rural communities, that perhaps provide more of a kind of local context. I don't know what thoughts you have on that. Callum, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah. I mean, clearly, any thresholds that are just based on hectares are going to be quite a blunt tool, to be honest. When the situation is a lot more nuanced, and yes, there will certainly be sites that wouldn't be within that particular threshold, and there might be a real public interest. So it is something I think that should be looked at. it's not for me to say whether the bill makes the right balance, but I do think the situation is a lot more nuanced than just hectares.
Mm-hmm. Malcolm?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Callum. Obviously, when you draw a line somewhere, people will fall below that line. A couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to a journalist who was looking at a community in Scotland that's been affected by certain land management decisions that fall below the thresholds that would be here, and that is obviously something that this bill would not resolve. So there are, I mentioned at the start, what's not in the bill, things like compulsory sale orders, things like reworking of the community right to buy. Maybe that could lead to a different way to targeting some of these particular sort of flashpoints, shall we say. Whether or not making sort of huge changes to this bill would be in scope in terms of addressing that, I'd be maybe surprised if you could do something at this stage. But I mean, there are models where you can say, I mean, down in England, they've got the Localism Act in terms of registering assets of community value. Obviously, it's not going to give a forced sale. It's actually just a pause in relation to transfers. You've got our own sort of chance to register community interest in land. So there are ways to maybe try and at least isolate some of these particular strategic resources. But as I say, I'm not sure what more you can do in relation to this bill.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next questions come from Bob Doris. Bob.
I want to follow up on some of the matters that Mark Ruskell was pursuing. Mark was pursuing about the narrow list of individual bodies that could make a complaint in relation to a breach under land management plans, and it was mentioned about perhaps an expanded role for the Land and Communities Commissioner, quite limited in relation to the role at present. Can I split my question into two parts? Can I think about a proactive role that they could have in a preventative area, if you like? Would witnesses think that work to encourage what best practice would look like in the development of land management plans would be something that the Commissioner would be well placed to support, perhaps identifying and sharing best practice where that becomes evident, but also perhaps identifying the thematic areas of weaknesses within plans themselves? As the bill stands, I'm not sure that the Land and Communities Commissioner would be able to do that or empowered to do that. Would that be a positive thing, Malcolm Coombe?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's an interesting one. So you've had a bit of a track. I mean, the Scottish Land Commission has been around for 6-7 years now, and obviously, for example, the outgoing Tenant Farming Commissioner had certain roles in relation to promulgating codes of practice. That was under statute. They had that role, but you also had certain protocols that the Land Commission was able to promulgate in relation to other aspects around community land. So that perhaps offers a degree of precedent to an extra statutory approach. So it's not on the face of the legislation, but they at least were able to use their sort of architecture to allow for guidance to be issued. Whether or not, as I mean, I've already mentioned the idea of the Land Communities Commissioner having a more active role, whether it's doing things of their own motion in terms of investigation, I suppose. And I know there was discussions around this in a previous session. That might change the dynamic of the Land Commission to an extent and move it away from its current sort of trying to sort of not be too one way or the other and be a bit more of a regulator almost. So you'd need to think about that carefully, but you could clearly do it if you wanted to put it in the face of the bill. So, yeah, bit of a mixed answer again, sorry.
Okay, so Mr Cooper, I think what you're perhaps suggesting is there could be an implicit ability for the Commission to do this, but not an explicit power. and perhaps we might want to consider an explicit power on the face of the bill?
You could, but as I say, the fact that you had certain protocols in areas where the Land Commission did not necessarily have that explicit power in the past perhaps allows you to be a bit more relaxed, but it very much depends on the direction the Land Commission takes.
Okay, I appreciate that. Callum MacLeod?
Yeah, I mean, my view on the question is I personally think that it is something that the Land and Communities Commissioner should be given the power to do. My own observation on the role is I do find it slightly curious that the Land and Communities Commissioner is not accountable to the Land Commission themselves, and I appreciate, you know, trying to move the Land Commission into more of a regulatory role needs to be thought about very, very carefully. But I did find it slightly curious that it was being treated as this kind of standalone role, and I can see that there might be more conducive to actually make the Land and Communities Commissioner fully accountable to the Scottish Land Commission themselves as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I had said the question was split into two parts, so there was that kind of preventative work to promote best practice and stop unintended things happening to raise the quality of land management plans. But I'm conscious we've spoken about the benefits and the drawbacks on a very narrow list of those who can allege a breach. So I'm wondering if, Callum MacLeod, first of all, if you can consider whether you think there should be an explicit power for the Land and Communities Commissioner to have a mix of light touch and deep delve proactive approach to making sure there's adherence to land management plans, for lack of a better description. They could randomly pull out 5 or 10 of them without any breach having been identified and just go and see what's going on. Go and have a look. Other regulatory bodies would take that similar approach, to be a risk-based approach to doing so. If they become aware of concerns, whether reported them or not, perhaps they should have a duty to investigate those concerns once they're under a risk-based approach to compliance of land management plans. But I suppose that's me taking a next step, Mr MacLeod, in relation to how that power might be exercised. But at the heart of it is whether there should be a power to do some proactive investigatory work without the reporting of a breach. Mr MacLeod.
Yeah, my own personal view on that is yes, they should. I can see it as being one of the powers that I think should sit with the Land and Communities Commissioner.
Okay, that's quite clear. Malcolm Coombe?
I'm minded to agree with Callum. There are different approaches to enforcing rules around there. You can have a more swashbuckling regulator, or you can have something that's designed that's based on someone applying. I can think of, say, the deposit protection scheme in the housing law field. You know, someone's got to apply if there's been a breach, and nothing will happen when no one applies. So it just depends what you think is appropriate for the context. I'm minded to agree with Callum.
I think it's worth putting on the record that I think all commissioners would want to see a commission that works in partnership with landowners across the country. Their first approach was not to look to identify breaches and look at sanctions, but to build up that relationship. But I think that the explicit power may be beneficial. Final question, Convener, we've kind of heard reference to this already about whether the obligation for landowners is to simply produce a land management plan, irrespective of the quality of it or otherwise, and indeed perhaps irrespective of whether it's complied with in any meaningful way. Just for clarity, section 44B(3)(c) requires the land management plan to set out how the owner is complying or intends to comply with the obligations set out in the regulations. And section 44E allows specific persons to allege a breach of an obligation imposed by regulations under section 44A. I think just asking that question may lead to the conclusion, is the drafting adequately clear to ensure that there are obligations to both produce and comply with a land management plan? If not, what suggestions would witnesses make about how we can improve that section of the bill? Maybe Callum MacLeod?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the drafting is adequately clear. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to give you a suggestion in terms of improving the drafting, but I think it does need to be looked at.
Okay, and finally, Malcolm, responding to that, should it be just not that a plan exists and is complied with, but that it should be of appropriate quality? And again, once we get to that context of appropriate quality, that's quite a hard thing to measure. Yeah. But surely the existence of a threadbare plan, which is then complied with, is an easy thing to develop and secure, but it doesn't really give a qualitative approach to whether the spirit of the legislation has been complied with. So is that section clear enough, and how would you maybe suggest changing it?
I'd probably need to take it away and actually think and try and think about possible drafting tweaks rather than shoot from the hip in relation to that today. And I'm happy to try and think about that. But yes, I would agree that you need to ensure it's not just an empty threat, or rather you need to make sure that all aspects of it can lead to what will be in a land management plan being meaningful. As you say, if someone just is able to churn out a threadbare plan, then it's not going to necessarily make much of a difference on the ground.
Convener, no further questions, and I should again stress there's no anticipation that most landowners would do so, but when we legislate, we have to legislate not just for the best landowners, but also for those that might be remiss in their obligations. But that's important to put on the record.
And I'm sure you're right that it's landowners of all stripes, whether it be private landowners, public landowners or community landowners, all have to fall within the same thing. Next questions come from Douglas.
Thanks, Convener. Moving on to Section 2 now, the community right to buy registration of interest in large land holdings. So, as the bill stands, if a landowner owns 1,000 hectares and he wants to sell all or even part of that land, there's a process that he has to go through in terms of to allow communities to give the communities right to sort of buy around that. And I guess that even selling a cottage within part of that land would trigger that process. So do you think that's right, or do you think the bill should be changed somehow to allow sort of smaller chunks of land to be sold within a large land holding, or do you think as it stands it's the right thing? Malcolm, I'll come to you first since you're here.
Thank you, Mr. London. I wouldn't mind there being some kind of de minimis small exception, subject to there also being the chance perhaps for the relevant community to say, actually, no, whilst you think it might be de minimis, we really like that bit of that site could be strategically important. So I agree that you probably, and it just sort of in terms of regulatory burden and in terms of mobilising everything in relation to something small that is unlikely to be of interest to local community groups does seem like quite a burden. But I would be conscious of sort of leaving another risk of not allowing for something that really does matter to be missed out on because of someone playing on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess even having a, let's say 1% of holding, that might be 1% that the community wants. So I guess it's how do you strike that balance, and how do you put something in place to accommodate the small transfers that are taking place and not making it overburdensome sort of process.
Quite. So it would almost be a sort of notice, counter notice, perhaps. If someone was to do something that's below a threshold, or below a de minimis percentage or whatever, or whether it's a percentage or whether it's a fixed figure, then, yeah, you could sort of almost, if you would otherwise have been able to benefit, you could almost have some kind of counter notice. And what that would look like, I'm not sure, but I think it could be workable. And there are examples of sort of counter notice sort of approaches and different types of, whether it's landlord and tenant legislation or whatever. So it could work.
And Callum, do you have a view on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, I can see the argument really for some level of de minimis or exceptions, and I think what Malcolm's maybe suggesting there in terms of an ability for there to be a counter notice served if it was really of special interest. I think most of these smaller things are unlikely to trigger a counter notice, so I could see something along these lines being quite workable.
And you both mentioned earlier on about the community right to buy process being under review. So do you think this bill coming through just now adds complexity to that, or do you think it's an opportunity for the government to get both things hand in hand and working seamlessly? Callum, I'll come to you first on this one.
Well, I made my views known earlier that I do think that that the community right to buy should have taken place by now, and I think it would be much more helpful had the community right to buy review been well underway. I do think it is complex. I had to read and reread the provisions myself a few times. I think, in terms of the specifics, I mentioned earlier that communities find that the late registration provisions surrounding the community right to buy aren't currently working for them. So it will potentially address some of the concerns there. So, for example, community groups concerned about not being able to use the community right to buy at all, whether late or otherwise. It now means that they're going to receive prior notification about certain sales and, of course, a potential opportunity to exercise a right to buy there. However, I think in the context of the community right to buy legislation, I do think that this particular amendment is only going to allow for a community purchase in probably some very limited circumstances, and I think community groups will find it pretty difficult to use for a couple of reasons. Mentioned earlier that the late registration provisions, they've not actually been used since I think around 2017. There's an understanding that effectively almost any late registration under the community right to buy is not going to be held to be in the public interest, and effectively can only be used when a community body is already compliant with the provisions of the community right to buy, and the application is in the process of being drafted, and they just almost haven't had time to submit it, so they are almost well underway. And the effect of that has meant that most late applications are almost defunct. What I am maybe querying about this new proposal to modify the ability of community groups to be given this opportunity, is it almost going to be treated as a late registration? In which case I would question whether in reality there will be that many opportunities for community groups to actually be successful. It also does then require ministers to be satisfied that there's a reasonable prospect of the application being registered. So effectively ministers have to almost prejudge the application itself. I'm not sure. Could there be perhaps a clearer statement that where ministers invite a community body to submit an application under these new provisions, whether it should almost be accepted for the purposes of the final decision making that there is a greater public interest in such an application. I'd be concerned otherwise that the public interest threshold just might be too high to meet, as is currently the case with late applications. The only other comment I was going to make on it is clearly on timescales. I'm not saying what the appropriate timescale should be, but it does strike me that 40 days for a community group to submit an application from a standing start, where ministers may think there's a real public interest in a community group submitting such an application, may be challenging to say the least, especially in where funding may be an issue. I appreciate there needs to be a balance struck here in terms of landowners' rights as well, but that's something that needs to be carefully considered. But my concern overall, without looking at the community rights to buy in general and not aligning that with a wider review of the community rights to buy, is that these new provisions may just be another community right to buy that community groups are finding is just too difficult to use.
I was going to ask you, Callum, about the...
Just say, sorry to cut you off in mid-flight. I'm really worried because I see Rhoda Grant sitting quietly on the screen, as she has done for this whole evidence session, as the clock ticks down, and she won't get her questions, and then I will have to deal with that. So if I could ask for succinct questions, succinct answers, where possible, I'd be really grateful, and then no one will be upset.
It's just on the timescales, it has got 70 days on the bill, 40 plus 30. Callum, you weren't sure whether you could give a view on what this timescale should be. So maybe Malcolm, do you have a view on what the timescale should be?
Not particularly. I fully agree with everything that Callum said. By the way, that's saved me from repeating any of that. So possibly a little bit longer in terms of allowing a community a bit more breathing space. But again, just how long that would be, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Sorry, Douglas. I should have waited till you finished. I apologise. Deputy Convener's next. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. Do you think the transfer test as proposed in the bill adequately takes into account public interest?
I'll go for it. I've not thought it hasn't at any point, and I'm now suddenly doubting myself because you've asked the question. I think it does. And I'll scrabble through my notes just to see if I've got anything to counter that, but maybe let Callum come in. That's my succinct answer, anyway.
Well, I think it does refer to, the wider sustainability of the community rather than maybe the public interest itself. But so I think the transfer test is perhaps a step away, from the previous public interest test that was considered during the consultation. So I don't think it defines or refers to public interest perhaps as clearly as, for example, the community rights to buy.
So therefore, I wonder, would it be more helpful then to have a very clear and explicit term in the bill, which was that this transfer test is actually a public interest test in the way in which the Land Commission recommended? Callum?
I think it would. I think it would. If that's government's intention, then I think it would make sense to be a bit more explicit about that.
I'd just add that I don't object to that, but even if it wasn't on the face of the bill, the way Article 1 of the First Protocol and sort of deprivations controls should only be allowed when they're in the public interest, I think it would be teased out by a different means anyway, but very happy for it to be in the face of the bill as well. And thank you, Callum, for reminding me of that provision. So thank you.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Callum, the issue of the provision of community sustainability. I suppose that will beg a question of what is community sustainability.
Yeah, indeed, that might be certainly a difficult thing to define, and I think that's part of the reason that I think public interest, as an express reference to public interest there, I think would have been more helpful.
Thanks.
Okay. And I needn't have been worried because we now, I think, have got to Rhoda. Time for your questions.
I'll just unmute myself to save some time. That evidence was really interesting. Both of you spoke about compulsory sale, compulsory purchase tests, and I wonder if that would help deal with some of your concerns about late registration and community right to buy.
I think certainly is one area. I was, based on previous consultations, a little bit surprised that it didn't find its way into the bill. But yes, it is one area where I think it would address some concerns that community groups have in terms of not being able to organise themselves quickly enough, and certainly not being able to use late registrations. So it might be something that the government may wish to consider again.
Yeah, I'll just endorse Callum again for brevity.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And is there anything else that would make it easier for late registrations? I appreciate that some communities don't want to register until they see land changing hands. Is there something that could be done that would simplify that and make it easier?
Community Lands Scotland published proposals that the committee may be aware, and certainly happy to share them, and suggested that perhaps the community right to buy could be turned into a two-stage process, certainly where a lighter pre-registration step could be in place, and then a secondary step that would allow for a late registration. But there might be an express provision in there that the fact that the community body had already effectively taken the earlier pre-registration step should be taken into account for the purposes of determining whether there was public interest in the late application. The issues currently with the community right to buy is, as the committee might be aware, it's a preemptive right, so almost all the work is effectively front-loaded for what is a very hypothetical situation, unless you do a late registration, and currently the evidence is that late registrations almost always don't succeed. So there were proposals put forward by Community Land Scotland, for example, that are worth looking at.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, I've had the benefit of speaking to Callum and Community Land Scotland, and along with the Scottish Land Commission, about some of those proposals, and I thought they were workable and could have worked in relation to the Part 2 scheme as it stands. As you've mentioned, there is an occasional perception that if a community was to go to registering a Part 2 right to buy, that could be inflammatory, that could be seen as sort of changing current relations with the landowner. But given that they've got to do it, they find themselves painted into that corner, perhaps. So yes, having something that could operate as a salve to that would, I think, be beneficial. Exactly how it would look, whether it could be catered for in this bill, or whether it's something that's going to have to wait for the community right to buy review that's also happening at the moment. I suppose we'll need to wait and see how that pans out.
Could I have just one final question, Convener? You both spoke about land management plans and buyers and what were they going to take on land management plans or not, and we also talked about community purchases where sustainable development had to be at the core of that. Do you believe that private buyers are being held in a different to different rules and regulations? Would it make it more equal if they had to sign up to sustainable development and a land management plan before they purchased, or would that be too unwieldy?
Do you mean community landowners who've purchased under the community right to buy?
Well, they're being held to a certain standard in that they have to show that their development is sustainable and it's in the public interest. Should private landowners be held to the same degree, and would that level the playing field between community and private buyers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't necessarily have a view on that policy point. I mean, I guess the point about the community right to buy is a form of compulsory acquisition. Of course, most community buyouts now don't take place under the community right to buy, so perhaps not all community landowners are going to be subject to that public interest test, and but yeah, I don't necessarily have a view on whether there's a two-tier system there.
Yeah, I just agree with Callum, and I suppose the issue in terms of just practical terms is where a community landowner has benefited from a land reform Scotland Act buyout in the past. If they were to slip from their standards, then clawback provisions can operate. It would depend in relation to other landowners what sort of sanction you could have, because you wouldn't be able to have the same practical sanction, I imagine. But in terms of having something in the land management plan and looking at this bill in front of us, I would certainly not be again having, or whether it's in regulations that follow, given how important land can be to so many people who aren't the owner, having something else in there could be could be worthwhile, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rhoda. I've got a few quick-fire questions at the end. I think Mark Ruskell said that £5,000 fine didn't seem very much. I think it might be a huge amount to very small farmers and small landowners. Is there an argument for doing the fine on the scale of the assets held and the management and the size of the management plan? Just thinking of ways around this, because £5,000, I think, to small-scale people would be a massive amount of money, might not be to some of the bigger investment companies. Would you go for a scaling, yes or no?
You could. But I mean, I remember whether it was a shaggy dog story of a rich footballer who was quite happy to park his car wherever he was in the city that he was working in because he had money and he was happy to pay whatever the fine was. You could have a scaling system, though. Switzerland do that in relation to speeding fines. So you could, but it would just depend how you fancy doing it and making it workable.
Callum?
Again, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I can see the attraction, but I don't know if is it just another layer of maybe complexity to look at a scaling system there.
I think some people are fined on the size of their assets, especially if you're speeding fines. I think they're graduated. Anyway, lotting. We've heard lots about small scale sales being stopped, and it could affect crofting estates where a crofting tenure house could be sold or purchased at, or indeed a croft purchased at under the statutory procedure. What about saying on lotting that small sites which haven't got a register of community interest on them could still be transacted? Would that allow people to buy plots for their horses or their garden ground or whatever that people look to sell and regularly happen? Callum?
What do you mean by smaller sites in terms of lotting?
Well, I mean, a couple of acres or 10 acres or something to do something that somebody might want to do that might trigger a lotting process. So if it wasn't part of a community interest in the plan, surely that should be encouraged to allow that to go on, to allow the community to flourish.
Well, I mean, Are you mean in a situation where a larger landowner is looking to acquire? Because my understanding...
No, I'm talking about larger landowners divesting some of their holdings to allow communities to flourish. I think we heard it in the sense of Athol Estates when we visited them, that there were small-scale transactions, that they were worried. And we also heard that from Buccleuch as well.
Yeah, maybe I've misread the provisions, but my understanding a lotting decision would only be carried out where, you know, the transfer was over a certain threshold of 1,000 hectares. Is that?
Yeah, but what we're saying is lotting would be triggered if land was to be sold. And I'm worried that it's going to stop small-scale transactions. I'm asking if there's a way around it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we mentioned de minimis earlier for that type of situation, and I certainly think that there's a good argument for it. And Malcolm mentioned this idea of a counter notice being served if it turned out that there was a real community interest. I think something along these lines could certainly be workable.
Malcolm.
Yeah, I'm happy with all Callum said there. I suppose the only other thing that you might throw in is there are concepts in other areas of law, insolvency law, where you've got gratuitous alienations, where someone has alienated property in a way that's designed to defeat creditors or something like that. So you might want to consider whether you could have something that would prevent abuse of that. Again, what that would look like, I'm not sure. Obviously, gratuitous alienation is far more calumnious than the situation at hand, but if someone was genuinely trying to defeat the policy goals of the legislation by engaging in a series of these transactions, then that could be problematic, and you might want to have some kind of safety valve in relation to that.
I didn't quite understand then, just another quick question, the Land and Communities Commissioner, fall totally within the Land Commission or have a separate role? Callum, you suggested that it might cause some problems if the Land Commission took on a regulatory role as well. So are you for keeping this role completely separate or separate?
I'm not sure it's cause problems. I think I don't think it should be kept as a separate role. My own view is I think it would make sense that the Commissioner should be ultimately accountable and part of the Land Commission. But I accept that any pivot in the role of the Land Commission needs to be looked at certainly quite carefully.
Malcolm.
I can understand why the Land and Communities Commissioner has been set up a bit like the Tenant Farming Commissioner. I can understand that. And in pure drafting terms, that probably makes sense as well. But that will mean they're sort of sui generis, unique within the... Well, not unique, because the Tenant Farming Commissioner is also a bit unique. So I can understand it, but... yes, they've got to be able to be held to account as well.
Okay, Tenant Farming Commissioner comes with specialist skills as part of his roles. Should the proposed Land and Community Commissioner come with skills, and should one of those not be having been a large landowner? So excluding somebody, but what skills should they have? Do you agree with that?
It's a tough question. Especially given the sort of disqualification that currently holding a sort of big holding could lead to. Clearly, it's got special skills involved, and I think, I mean, there is obviously a public appointments process that people would be stress tested in and what have you. Whether you would make it a requirement, though, I mean, that could lead to perception you're sculpting the pool. I'm not sure.
Well, you couldn't force him or her, whoever took on the role, to sell their holding just to take on the role. That's never going to work, is it? So you're excluding them. Are you for excluding them or not?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Callum, specialist skills and excluding large landowners.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would exclude large landholders from that role. I do think it is a role, though, that will require specialist skills. I think compared to the Tenant Farming Commissioner role, it is much more difficult to define what these specialist skills should be, and it's also for that reason that I do think the role being standalone from the Land Commission itself maybe is unhelpful there, and that might be the case for making it a little bit more accountable to the Land Commission themselves, and not quite as standalone in the way that the Tenant Farming Commissioner is, because I think it is much easier to define the specialist skills and the job of the Tenant Farming Commissioner.
Yep. Malcolm.
Just looking quickly at sort of section 6 of the bill and the new sort of section 11, subsection 3A, there is a necessity for expertise or experience in land management, community empowerment. I'd be happy enough for something else to be added to that, but I think that probably should be okay.
So, best person for the job, whatever they've done in the past, and whatever their politics.
I'd be happy with that, yeah. And that's
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the session. Sorry for those quick-fire questions at the end, but the time and the clock has been ticking all morning. So thank you very much for giving evidence this morning. And I'm now going to move the meeting into private session. So thank you very much.